Section 1 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 1 of the Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. The Gooford Grapevine. Some years ago my wife was in poor health, and our family doctor, in whose skill and honesty I had implicit confidence, advised a change of climate. I shared, from an unprofessional standpoint, his opinion that the raw winds, the chill rains, and the violent changes of temperature that characterized the winters in the region of the Great Lakes tended to aggravate my wife's difficulty, and would undoubtedly shorten her life if she remained exposed to them. The doctor's advice was that we seek not a temporary place of sojourn, but a permanent residence in a warmer and more equable climate. I was engaged at the time in grape culture in northern Ohio, and as I liked the business and had given it much study, I decided to look for some other locality suitable for carrying it on. I thought of sunny France, of sleepy Spain, of Southern California, but there were objections to them all. It occurred to me that I might find what I wanted in some one of our own Southern States. It was a sufficient time after the war for conditions in the South to have become somewhat settled, and I was enough of a pioneer to start a new industry if I could not find a place where grape culture had been tried. I wrote to a cousin who had gone into the turpentine business in central North Carolina. He assured me, in response to my inquiries, that no better place could be found in the South than the State and neighborhood where he lived. The climate was perfect for health, and, in conjunction with the soil, ideal for grape culture. Labor was cheap, and land could be bought for a mere song. He gave us a cordial invitation to come and visit him while he looked into the matter. We accepted the invitation, and after several days of leisurely travel, the last 100 miles of which were up a river on a sidewheel steamer, we reached our destination, a quaint old town which I shall call Patesville, because, for one reason, that is not its name. There was a red brick market house in the public square, with a tall tower, which held a four-faced clock that struck the hours, and from which there pealed out a curfew at 9 o'clock. There were 2 or 3 hotels, a court-house, a jail, stores, offices, and all the appurtenances of a county seat and a commercial emporium. For while Patesville numbered only 4,000 or 5,000 inhabitants, of all shades of complexion, it was one of the principal towns in North Carolina, and had a considerable trade in cotton and naval stores. This business activity was not immediately apparent to my unaccustomed eyes. Indeed, when I first saw the town, there brooded over it a calm that seemed almost sabbatic in its restfulness, though I learned later on that underneath its somnolent exterior the deeper currents of life, love and hatred, joy and despair, ambition and avarice, faith and friendship, flowed not less steadily than in livelier latitudes. We found the weather delightful at that season, the end of summer, and were hospitably entertained. Our host was a man of means, and evidently regarded our visit as a pleasure, and we were therefore correspondingly at our ease, and in a position to act with the coolness of judgment desirable in making so radical a change in our lives. My cousin placed a horse and buggy at our disposal, and himself acted as our guide until I became somewhat familiar with the country. I found that grape culture, while it had never been carried on to any great extent, was not entirely unknown in the neighborhood. Several planters thereabouts had attempted it on a commercial scale in former years, with greater or less success. But, like most Southern industries, it had felt the blight of war and had fallen into desuetude. I went several times to look at a place that I thought might suit me. It was a plantation of considerable extent that had formerly belonged to a wealthy man by the name of McAdoo. The estate had been for years involved in litigation between disputing heirs, during which period shiftless cultivation had well nigh exhausted the soil. There had been a vineyard of some extent on the place, but it had not been attended to since the war, and had lapsed into utter neglect. The vines, here partly supported by decayed and broken down trellises, were twining themselves among the branches of the slender saplings which had sprung up among them, grew in wild and unpruned luxuriance, and the few scattered grapes they bore were the undisputed prey of the first comer. The site was admirably adapted to grape raising. The soil, with a little attention, could not have been better, and with the native grape, the luscious scuppernong, as my main reliance in the beginning, I felt sure that I could introduce and cultivate successfully a number of other varieties. One day I went over with my wife to show her the place. We drove out of the town over a long wooden bridge that spanned a spreading mill pond, past the long whitewashed fence surrounding the county fair ground, and struck into a road so sandy that the horses' feet sank to the fetlocks. Our route lay partly uphill and partly down, for we were in the Sandhill County. We drove past cultivated farms, and then by abandoned fields grown up in scrub oak and short-leaved pine, and once or twice through the solemn aisles of the virgin forest, where the tall pines, well nigh meeting over the narrow road, shut out the sun, and wrapped us in cloistral solitude. Once, at a cross roads, I was in doubt as to the turn to take, and we sat there waiting 10 minutes. We had already caught some of the native infection of the restlessness for some human being to come along who could direct us on our way. At length a little negro girl appeared, walking straight as an arrow, with a piggin full of water on her head. After a little patient investigation, necessary to overcome the child's shyness, we learned what we wished to know, and at the end of about 5 miles from the town reached our destination. We drove between a pair of decayed gate posts. The gate itself had long since disappeared, and up a straight sandy lane between 2 lines of rotting rail fence, partly concealed by jimson weeds and briers, to the open space where a dwelling house had once stood, evidently a spacious mansion, if we might judge from the ruined chimneys that were still standing, and the brick pillars on which the sills rested. The house itself, we had been informed, had fallen a victim to the fortunes of war. We alighted from the buggy, walked about the yard for a while, and then wandered off into the adjoining vineyard. Upon Annie's complaining of weariness, I led the way back to the yard, where a pine log, lying under a spreading elm, afforded a shady though somewhat hard seat. One end of the log was already occupied by a venerable looking colored man. He held on his knees a hat full of grapes, over which he was smacking his lips with great gusto, and a pile of grape skins near him indicated that the performance was no new thing. We approached him at an angle from the rear, and were close to him before he perceived us. He respectfully rose as we drew near, and was moving away, when I begged him to keep his seat. "Don't let us disturb you," I said. "There is plenty of room for us all." He resumed his seat with somewhat of embarrassment. While he had been standing, I had observed that he was a tall man, and, though slightly bowed by the weight of years, apparently quite vigorous. He was not entirely black, and this fact, together with the quality of his hair, which was about 6 inches long and very bushy, except on the top of his head, where he was quite bald, suggested a slight strain of other than negro blood. There was a shrewdness in his eyes, too, which was not altogether African, and which, as we afterwards learned from experience, was indicative of a corresponding shrewdness in his character. He went on eating the grapes, but did not seem to enjoy himself quite so well as he had apparently done before he became aware of our presence. "Do you live around here?" I asked, anxious to put him at his ease. "Yas, suh. I lives dere ober yonder, behind de next sand hill, on de Lumberton Plank Road." "Do you know anything about the time when this vineyard was cultivated?" "Lawd bless you, suh, I knows all erbout it. Dey ain' na'er a man in dis settlement w'at won't tell you ole Julius McAdoo wuz born en raise' on dis yer same plantation. Is you de Norv'n gemman w'at's gwine ter buy de ole vimya'd?" "I am looking at it," I replied, "but I don't know that I shall care to buy unless I can be reasonably sure of making something out of it." "Well, suh, you is a stranger to me, en I is a stranger to you, en we is bofe strangers to one anudder, but ef I 'uz in yo' place I wouldn' buy dis vimya'd." "Why not?" I asked. "Well, I don't know whether you believes in conjurin' er not. Some er de w'ite folks don't, er says dey don't. But de trufe er de matter is dat dis yer ole vimya'd is goophered." "Is what?" I asked, not grasping the meaning of this unfamiliar word. "Is goophered, conjured, bewitch'." He imparted this information with such solemn earnestness, and with such an air of confidential mystery, that I felt somewhat interested, while Annie was evidently much impressed, and drew closer to me. "How do you know it is bewitched?" I asked. "I wouldn' 'spec' fer you ter b'liebe me 'less you know all 'bout de facts, but ef you en young miss dere don't min' listenin' to a' ole nigger run on a minute er two w'ile you're restin', I kin 'splain to you how it all happen'." We assured him that we would be glad to hear how it all happened, and he began to tell us. At first the current of his memory, or imagination, seemed somewhat sluggish, but as his embarrassment wore off, his language flowed more freely, and the story acquired perspective and coherence. As he became more and more absorbed in the narrative, his eyes assumed a dreamy expression, and he seemed to lose sight of his auditors, and to be living over again in monologue his life on the old plantation. "Ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo," he began, "bought dis place long many year befo' de wah, en I remember well w'en he sot out all dis yer part er de plantation in scuppernon's. De vimes growed monst'us fas', en Mars Dugal' made 1,000 gallon er scuppernon wine eve'y year. Now ef dey's anything a nigger lub, nex' ter 'possum en chicken en watermillions, it's scuppernon's. Dey ain' nuffin dat kin stan' up sidin' de scuppernon fer sweetness. Sugar ain' a circumstance to scuppernon. W'en de season is nigh 'bout ober, en de grapes begin ter swivel up des a little wid de wrinkles er ole age, w'en de skin gits sof' en brown, den de scuppernon make you smack yo' lip en roll yo' eye en wush fer mo'. So I reckon it ain't very 'stonishin' dat niggers lubs scuppernon. Dey wuz a sight er niggers in de neighborhood er de vimya'd. Dey wuz ole Mars Henry Braboy's niggers, en ole Mars Jeems McLean's niggers, en Mars Dugal's own niggers. Den dey wuz a settlement er free niggers en po' buckras down by de Wim'l'ton Road, en Mars Dugal's had de only vimya'd in de neighborhood. I reckon it ain't so much nowadays, but befo' de wah en slab'ry times, a nigger didn' min' gwine 5 er 10 mile in de night w'en dey wuz somethin' good ter eat at de udder een'. So atter a w'ile Mars Dugal' begin ter miss his scuppernon'. Co'se he 'cused de niggers er it, but dey all denied it ter de las'. Mars Dugal' sot spring guns en steel traps, en he en de oberseah sot up nights once er twice, 'tel one night Mars Dugal', he's a monst'us keerless man, got his leg shot full er cow peas, but somehow er nudder dey couldn' neber ketch none er de niggers. I don't know how it happen', but it happen' des like I tell you, en de grapes kep' on a goin' des de same. But bimeby ole Mars Dugal' fix up a plan ter stop it. Dey wuz a Conjure Woman livin' down 'mongs' de free niggers on de Wim'l'ton Road, en all de darkies from Rockfish ter Beaver Crick wuz feared er her. She could work de mos' powerfulest kin' er goopher, could make people hab fits, rheumatiz, make 'em des dwindle away en die, en dey say she went out ridin' de niggers at night, fer she wuz a witch 'sides bein' a Conjure Woman. Mars Dugal' hearn 'bout Aun' Peggy's doin's, and began to reflect whether or no he couldn't get her to help him keep the niggers off in the grapevines. One day, in the spring of the year, old Miss pack up a basket of chicken and pound cake and a bottle of scuppernong wine, and Mars Dugal tuck it in his buggy and drive over to Aunt Peggy's cabin. He took the basket in and had a long talk with Aunt Peggy. The next day, Aunt Peggy come up to the vineyard. The niggers seed her slipping round, and they soon found out what she was doing there. Mars Dugal had hired her to goofer the grapevines. She santered round 'mongst the vines, and took a leaf from this one, and a grape hull from that one, and a grape seed from another one, and then a little twig from here, and a little pinch of dirt from there, and put it all in a big black bottle, with a snake's tooth and a speckled hen's gall and some hairs from a black cat's tail, and then filled the bottle with scuppernong wine. When she got the goofer all ready and fixed, she took and went out in the woods and buried it under the root of a red oak tree, and then come back and told one of the niggers she done goofer the grapevines, and every nigger what eat them grapes would be sure to die inside 12 months. After dat, the niggers let the scuppernongs 'lone, and Mars Dugal didn't have no 'casion to find no mo' fault. And the season was most gone when a strange gentleman stopped at the plantation one night to see Mars Dugal on some business, and his coachman, seeing the scuppernongs growing so nice and sweet, slipped round behind the smokehouse and ate all the scuppernongs he could hold. Nobody didn't notice it at the time, but that night, on the way home, the gentleman's hoss runned away and killed the coachman. When we hearn the news, Aunt Lucy, the cook, she up and say she seed the strange nigger eating of the scuppernongs behind the smokehouse, and then we knowed the goofer had been a working. Then one of the nigger childrens runned away from the quarters one day and got in the scuppernongs and died the next week. White folks say he died of the fever, but the niggers knowed it was the goofer. So you can be sure the darkies didn't have much to do with them scuppernong vines. When the scuppernong season was over for that year, Mars Dugal found he had made 1,500 gallons of wine, and one of the niggers heard him laughing with the overseer fit to kill, and saying them 1,500 gallons of wine was monstrous good interest on the $10 he laid out on the vineyard. So I 'lows he paid Aunt Peggy $10 for the goofer the grapevines. The goofer didn't work no more till the next summer, when 'long towards the middle of the season one of the field hands died, and as that let Mars Dugal short of hands, he went off to town for to buy another. He fetched a new nigger home with him. He was a old nigger, the cutter of a ginger cake, and bald as a hoss apple on the top of his head. He was a pert old nigger, though. He could do a big day's work. Now, it happened that one of the niggers on the next plantation, one of old Mars Henry Brayboy's niggers, had runned away the day before, and took to the swamp, and old Mars Dugal and some of the other neighbor white folks had gone out with the guns and the dogs for to help 'em hunt for the nigger, and the hands on our own plantation was all so flusterated that we forgot to tell the new hand 'bout the goofer on the scuppernong vines, 'cause he smelled the grapes and see the vines, and at the dark the first thing he done was to slip off to the grapevines 'thout saying nuffin to nobody. Next morning he told some of the niggers 'bout the fine bait of scuppernong he et the night befo'. When they told him 'bout the goofer on the grapevines, he is dat terrified dat he turned pale, and looked just like he gwine to die right in his tracks. The overseer come up and asked what is the matter, and when they told him Henry been eating of the scuppernongs, and he got goofer on him, he gin Henry a big drink of whiskey, and 'lowed dat the next rainy day he'd take him over to Aunt Peggy's, and see if she wouldn't take the goofer off'n him, seeing as he didn't know nuffin 'bout it till he done ate the grapes. Sho' nuff it rained the next day, and the overseer went over to Aunt Peggy's with Henry. And Aunt Peggy say that bein' as Henry didn't know 'bout the goofer, and ate the grapes in ignorance of the consequences, she reckoned she mought be able fer to take the goofer off'n him. So she fetch out a bottle with some conjure medicine in it, and po' some out in a gourd fer Henry to drink. He managed to get it down. He say it tastes like whiskey with somethin' bitter in it. She 'lowed dat'd keep the goofer off'n him till next spring, but when the sap begin to rise in the grapevines, he had to come and see her again, and she tell him what else to do. Next spring, when the sap commenced to rise in the scuppernong vine, Henry took a ham one night. Where'd he get the ham, I don't know. Dey wa'n't no hams on the plantation 'cep'n what 'uz in the smoke house, but I never see Henry 'bout the smoke house. But as I was sayin', he took the ham over to Aunt Peggy's, and Aunt Peggy tole him dat when Mars Dugal' begin to prune the grapevines, he mus' go and take and scrape off the sap where it ooze out of the cuttins of the vines, and 'noint his bald head wid it, and ef he do dat once a year, de goopher wouldn't wuk agin him long ez he done it. And bein' as he fotch her the ham, she fix it so he kin eat all de scuppernong he want. So Henry gnawed his head wid de sap out'n de big grapevine des halfway 'twixt de quarters en de big house, en de goopher nebber wuk agin him dat summer. But de beatenis' thing you eber see happen to Henry. Up to dat time he wuz ez bald ez a sweet'n' 'tater, but des ez soon ez de young leaves begun to come out on de grapevines, de ha'r begun to grow out on Henry's head, en by de middle er de summer he had de biggest head of ha'r on de plantation. Befo' dat, Henry had tol'able good hair roun' de edges, but soon ez de young grapes begin to come, Henry's ha'r begin to curl all up in little balls des like his here reg'lar grappy hair, en by de time de grapes got ripe his head look des like a bunch er grapes. Combin' it didn't do no good. He wuk at it half de night wid a Jim Crow, en think he git it straighten' out, but in de mawnin' de grapes 'ud be dere des de same. So he gin it up, en tried to keep de grapes down by havin' his hair cut short. Footnote: a small card, resembling a currycomb in construction, and used by negroes in the rural districts instead of a comb. End footnote. But dat wa'n't de quariest thing about de goopher. When Henry come to the plantation, he was gettin' a little old and stiff in the joints. But dat summer he got des ez spry and lively as any young nigger on the plantation. Fac', he got so biggity dat Mars Jackson, de oberseer, had to th'eaten to whip him ef he didn't stop cuttin' up his dittos and behave hisse'f. But de mos' cur'ous thing happened in de fall, when de sap begin to go down in de grapevines. Fus', when de grapes 'uz gethered, de knots begin to straighten out in Henry's hair, en when de leaves begin to fall, Henry's hair 'mence' to drap out. En when de vines 'uz bare, Henry's head wuz baller dan it wuz in de spring, en he begin to git old en stiff in de joints ag'in, en paid no mo' 'tention to de gals durin' de whole winter. En nex' spring, when he rubbed de sap on ag'in, he got young ag'in, en so supple en lively dat none er de young niggers on de plantation couldn't jump, ner dance, ner hoe ez much cotton ez Henry. But in de fall er de year his grapes 'mence' to straighten out, en his joints to git stiff, en his hair drap off, en de rheumatic begin to wrestle wid him. Now ef you'd 'a' knowed ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo, you'd 'a' knowed dat it had to be a mighty rainy day when he couldn't find somethin' fer his niggers to do, en it had to be a mighty little hole he couldn't crawl th'ough, en had to be a monst'us cloudy night when a dollar git by him in de darkness. En w'en he see how Henry git young in de spring en ole in de fall, he 'lowed ter hisse'f ez how he could make mo' money out'n Henry dan by wukkin' him in de cotton fiel'. 'Long de nex' spring, atter de sap 'mence' to rise en Henry 'n'inted his head en started fer ter git young en supple, Mars Dugal' up en tuk Henry to town en sol' 'im fer $1,500. Co'se de man w'at bought Henry didn' know nuffin 'bout de goopher, en Mars Dugal' didn' see no 'casion fer ter tell 'im. 'Long to'ds de fall, w'en de sap went down, Henry begin to git ole ag'in, same ez usual, en his noo marster begin to git skeered less'n he gwine lose his $1,500 nigger. He sent fer a mighty fine doctor, but de medicine didn't 'pear to do no good. De goopher had a good holt. Henry tole de doctor 'bout de goopher, but de doctor des laugh at him. One day in de winter Mars Dugal' went to town, en was santerin' 'long de main street w'en who should he meet but Henry's noo marster. Dey said howdy, en Mars Dugal' ax' him ter hab a seegyar. En atter dey run on a w'ile 'bout de craps en de weather, Mars Dugal' ax' him sorter keerless, like ez ef he des thought of it, "How you like de nigger I sol' you las' spring?" Henry's marster shuck his head en knocked de ashes off'n his seegyar. "'Spec' I made a bad bargain w'en I bought dat nigger. Henry done good wuk all de summer, but sence de fall set in, he 'pears to be sorter pinin' away. Dey ain't nuffin particular de matter wid 'im, leastways de doctor say so, 'ceptin' a tech er de rheumatiz, but his hair is all fell out, en ef he don't pick up his strengt mighty soon, I 'spec' I'm gwine ter lose 'im.' Dey smoked on a w'ile, en bimeby ole Mars say, 'Well, a bargain's a bargain, but you en me is good frien's, en I don't wanter see you lose all de money you paid fer dat nigger, en ef w'at you say is so, en I ain't sputtin' it, he ain't wuff much now. I 'spec's you worked him too hard dis summer, er else de swamps down here don't agree wid de Sand Hill nigger. So you jes' lemme know, en ef he gits any wusser, I'll be willin' ter give you $500 fer 'im, en take my chances on his livin'.' Sho' 'nuff, w'en Henry begun ter draw up wid de rheumatiz, en it look like he gwine ter die fer sho', his noo marster sen' fer Mars Dugal', en Mars Dugal' give 'im w'at he promise', en brung Henry home ag'in. He tuk good care of 'im durin' de winter, give 'im whiskey ter rub his rheumatiz en terbacker ter smoke, en all he want ter eat, 'ca'se a nigger w'at he could make $1,000 a year off'n didn't grow on every huckleberry bush. Nex' spring, w'en de sap rise en Henry's hair commenced ter sprout, Mars Dugal' sol' 'im ag'in down in Robeson County dis time, en he kep' dat sellin' business up fer 5 year er mo'. Henry neber say nuffin 'bout de goopher to his noo marsters, 'ca'se he know he gwine ter be tuk good care of de nex' winter w'en Mars Dugal' buy 'im back, en Mars Dugal' made 'nuff money off'n Henry ter buy anudder plantation ober on Beaver Crick. But 'long 'bout de een' er dat 5 year, dey come a stranger ter stop at de plantation. De fus day he 'uz here, he went out wid Mars Dugal' en spent all de mornin' lookin' ober de vimya'd, en atter dinner dey spent all de evenin' playin' kyards. De niggers soon 'skiver' dat he wuz a Yankee, en dat he come down ter Norf C'lina fer ter learn de w'ite folks how ter raise grapes en make wine. He promise' Mars Dugal' he could make de grape vimes bear twice ez many grapes, en dat de noo wine press he wuz a sellin' would make mo' d'n twice ez many gallons er wine. En ole Mars Dugal' des drunk it all in, des 'peared ter be bewitched by dat Yankee. W'en de darkies see dat Yankee runnin' roun' de vimya'd en diggin' under de grape vimes, dey shook deir heads, en 'lowed dat dey feared Mars Dugal' losin' his min'. Mars Dugal' had all de dirt dug away from under de roots er all de scuppernum vines, en let 'em stan' dat way fer a week er mo'. Den dat Yankee made de niggers fix up a mixtry er lime en ashes en manyo, en po' it roun' de roots er de grape vimes. Den he 'vise Mars Dugal' fer ter trim de vimes close't, en Mars Dugal' tuk en done eve'ything de Yankee tole 'im ter do. Durin' all dis time, min' you, dis yer Yankee wuz libbin' off'n de fat er de lan' at de big house, en playin' kyards wid Mars Dugal' eve'y night, en dey say Mars Dugal' los' more'n $1,000 durin' de week dat Yankee wuz a ruinin' de grape vimes. W'en de sap rise nex' spring, ole Henry 'nointed his head ez usual, en his hair commenced ter grow des de same ez it done eve'y year. De scuppernum vimes growed monst'us fas', en de leabes wuz greener en thicker dan dey eber be'n durin' my remembrance. En Henry's hair growed out thicker dan eber, en it 'peared ter git younger en younger, en suppler en suppler. En seein' ez he wuz short er hands dat spring, havin' tuk in considerable new groun', Mars Dugal' 'cluded he wouldn' sell Henry till he git de crap in en de cotton chop', so he kep' Henry on de plantation. But 'long 'bout time fer de grapes ter come on de scuppernum vimes, dey 'peared ter come a change ober 'em. De leaves withered en swivel up, en de young grapes turn yeller, en bimeby eve'ybody on de plantation could see dat de whole vimya'd wuz dyin'. Mars Dugal' tuk en watered de vimes en done all he could, but it wa'n't no use. Dat Yankee had done bust de watermelon. One time de vines picked up a bit, en Mars Dugal' 'lowed dey wuz gwine come out ag'in, but dat Yankee done dug too close under de roots, en pruned de branches too close ter de vime, en all dat lime en ashes done burnt de life out'n de vimes, en dey des keep a witherin' en a swivelin'. All dis time de goopher wuz a workin'. W'en de vimes sta'ted ter wither, Henry 'mence' ter complain er his rheumatiz, en w'en de leaves begin ter dry up, his hair 'mence' ter drap out. W'en de vimes fresh up a bit, Henry'd git peart ag'in, en w'en de vimes withered ag'in, Henry'd git ole ag'in, and just kept getting mo' and mo' fitting for nothing. He just pined away and finally took to his cabin, and when the big vine, where he got the sap to 'noint his head, withered and turned yaller and died, Henry died too, just went out sort of like a cannel. Dey didn't appear to be nuffin matter wid him, 'cep'n the rheumatiz, but his strengt just dwindled away till he didn't have enough left to draw his breath. De goopher had got on de boat, and throwed Henry dat time fer good and all. Mars Dugal took on might'ly 'bout losin' his vimes and his nigger in de same year, and he swore dat ef he could git holt of dat Yankee, he'd wear him to a frazzle, and den chaw up de frazzle. And he done it, too, fer Mars Dugal's a monst'us brash man w'en he once git started. He sot de vimya'd out ober ag'in, but it was 3–4 year befo' de vimes got ter bearin' any scuppernon's. W'en de wah broke out, Mars Dugal raise a company and went off to fight de Yankees. He say he was mighty glad dat wah come, and he does want to kill a Yankee for every dollar he los' 'long er dat grape raisin' Yankee. And I 'spec' he would 'a' done it, too, ef de Yankees hadn't 'spicioned somethin' and killed him fus'. Atter de surrender, ole Miss moved to town, de niggers all scattered away from de plantation, and de vimya'd ain't be'n cultivated sence." "Is that story true?" asked Annie doubtfully, but seriously, as the old man concluded his narrative. "It's des ez true as I'm a settin' here, miss. Dere's a easy way to prove it. I kin lead de way right to Henry's grave ober yonder in de plantation buryin' groun'. En I'll tell you what, massa, I wouldn't 'vise you to buy dis yer ole vimya'd, 'cause de goopher's on it yit, en dey ain't no tellin' w'en it's gwine ter crap out. But I thought you said all the old vines died." "Dey did 'pear ter die, but a few of 'em come out ag'in, en is mixed in 'mongst de others. I ain't scared ter eat de grapes, 'cause I knows de ole vimes from de new ones, but wid strangers dey ain't no tellin' w'at mought happen. I wouldn't 'vise you ter buy dis vimya'd." I bought the vineyard, nevertheless, and it has been for a long time in a thriving condition, and is often referred to by the local press as a striking illustration of the opportunities open to Northern capital in the development of Southern industries. The luscious scuppernong holds first rank among our grapes, though we cultivate a great many other varieties, and our income from grapes packed and shipped to the Northern markets is quite considerable. I have not noticed any developments of the goopher in the vineyard, although I have a mild suspicion that our colored assistants do not suffer from want of grapes during the season. I found when I bought the vineyard that Uncle Julius had occupied a cabin on the place for many years, and derived a respectable revenue from the product of the neglected grape vines. This doubtless accounted for his advice to me not to buy the vineyard, though whether it inspired the goopher story I am unable to state. I believe, however, that the wages I paid him for his services as coachman, for I gave him employment in that capacity, were more than an equivalent for anything he lost by the sale of the vineyard. End of the Goophered Grapevine. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 2 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 2 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Poe Sandy. On the northeast corner of my vineyard, in central North Carolina, and fronting on the Lumberton Plank Road, there stood a small frame house of the simplest construction. It was built of pine lumber, and contained but one room, to which one window gave light, and one door admission. Its weather-beaten sides revealed a virgin innocence of paint. Against one end of the house, and occupying half its width, there stood a huge brick chimney. The crumbling mortar had left large cracks between the bricks. The bricks themselves had begun to scale off in large flakes, leaving the chimney sprinkled with unsightly blotches. These evidences of decay were but partially concealed by a creeping vine, which extended its slender branches hither and thither in an ambitious but futile attempt to cover the whole chimney. The wooden shutter, which had once protected the unglazed window, had fallen from its hinges, and lay rotting in the rank grass and jimson weeds beneath. This building, I learned when I bought the place, had been used as a schoolhouse for several years prior to the breaking out of the war, since which time it had remained unoccupied, save when some stray cow or vagrant hog had sought shelter within its walls from the chill rains and nipping winds of winter. One day my wife requested me to build her a new kitchen. The house, erected by us when we first came to live upon the vineyard, contained a very conveniently arranged kitchen, but for some occult reason my wife wanted a kitchen in the back yard, apart from the dwelling house, after the usual Southern fashion. Of course I had to build it. To save expense, I decided to tear down the old schoolhouse, and use the lumber, which was in a good state of preservation, in the construction of the new kitchen. Before demolishing the old house, however, I made an estimate of the amount of material contained in it, and found that I would have to buy several hundred feet of lumber additional, in order to build the new kitchen according to my wife's plan. One morning old Julius McAdoo, our colored coachman, harnessed the gray mare to the rockaway, and drove my wife and me over to the sawmill from which I meant to order the new lumber. We drove down the long lane which led from our house to the plank road. Following the plank road for about a mile, we turned into a road running through the forest and across the swamp to the sawmill beyond. Our carriage jolted over the half-rotted corduroy road which traversed the swamp, and then climbed the long hill leading to the sawmill. When we reached the mill, the foreman had gone over to a neighboring farmhouse, probably to smoke or gossip, and we were compelled to await his return before we could transact our business. We remained seated in the carriage, a few rods from the mill, and watched the leisurely movements of the mill hands. We had not waited long before a huge pine log was placed in position. The machinery of the mill was set in motion, and the circular saw began to eat its way through the log, with a loud whir, which resounded throughout the vicinity of the mill. The sound rose and fell in a sort of rhythmic cadence, which, heard from where we sat, was not unpleasing, and not loud enough to prevent conversation. When the saw started on its second journey through the log, Julius observed in a lugubrious tone, and with a perceptible shudder, but dat just do cuddle my blood." "What's the matter, Uncle Julius?" inquired my wife, who is of a very sympathetic turn of mind. "Does the noise affect your nerves?" "No, Miss Annie," replied the old man with emotion, "I ain' nervous, but dat saw, a cuttin' and grindin' th'ough dat stick er timber, and moanin' and groanin' and sweekin', kyars my 'memb'ance back ter ole times, and minds me er po' Sandy." The pathetic intonation with which he lengthened out the "po' Sandy" touched a responsive chord in our own hearts. "And who was poor Sandy?" asked my wife, who takes a deep interest in the stories of plantation life which she hears from the lips of the older colored people. Some of these stories are quaintly humorous, others wildly extravagant, revealing the oriental cast of the negro's imagination, while others, poured freely into the sympathetic ear of a Northern bred woman, disclose many a tragic incident of the darker side of slavery. "Sandy," said Julius, replying to my wife's question, "was a nigger w'at used to belong to ole Mars Marrabo McSwain. Mars Marrabo's place was on the udder side of the swamp, right next to yo' place. Sandy was a monst'us good nigger, and could do so many things there 'bout the plantation, and allers 'ten' to his work so well, dat w'en Mars Marrabo's chilluns growed up and married off, dey all of 'em wanted dey daddy fer ter gin 'em Sandy fer a weddin' present. But Mars Marrabo knowed de res' wouldn't be satisfied ef he gin Sandy ter e'ry one of 'em. So w'en dey wuz all done married, he fix it by 'lowing one of his chilluns to take Sandy for a month or so, and then anudder for a month or so, and so on dat a way till they had all had 'em de same length of time. En den dey would all take 'em roun' ag'in, 'ceptin' oncet in a while w'en Mars Marrabo would len 'em to some of his other kinfolks roun' de country, w'en dey was short of hands. Till bimeby it got so Sandy didn't hardly know where he was gwine ter stay fum one week's end ter de other. One time, w'en Sandy was lent out as usual, a speculator come along wid a lot of niggers, en Mars Marrabo swapped Sandy's wife off fer a new 'oman. W'en Sandy come back, Mars Marrabo gin him $1 en 'lowed he was monst'us sorry fer de break-up of de family, but de speculator had gin him big boot, en times was hard en money scarce, en so he was bleedst ter make a trade. Sandy tuk on some 'bout losin' his wife, but he soon seed dey wa'n't no use cryin' ober spilt molasses, en bein' ez he lacked de looks er de new 'oman, he tuk up wid her atter she be'n on de plantation a month er so. Sandy en his new wife got on mighty well tergedder, en de niggers all 'mence' ter talk 'bout how lovin' dey wuz. W'en Tenny was tuk sick once, Sandy useter set up all night wid her, en den go ter work in de mawnin des lack he had his reg'lar sleep, en Tenny would 'a' done anythin' in de worl' fer her Sandy. Sandy en Tenny hadn't been libbin' tergedder fer mo' d'n 2 months befo' Mars Marrabo's ole uncle, w'at lived down in Robeson County, sent up ter fin' out ef Mars Marrabo couldn't len' him or hire him a good han' fer a month er so. Sandy's marster was one er dese yer easy goin' folks w'at wanter please eve'ybody, en he says yes, he could len' him Sandy. En Mars Marrabo tole Sandy fer ter git ready ter go down ter Robeson nex' day fer ter stay a month er so. It was monst'us hard on Sandy fer ter take him away fum Tenny. It was so fur down to Robeson dat he didn't have no chance er comin' back ter see her till de time was up. He wouldn't 'a' min' comin' 10 or 15 mile at night ter see Tenny, but Mars Marrabo's uncle's plantation was mo' d'n 40 mile off. Sandy was mighty sad en cas' down atter w'at Mars Marrabo tole him, en he says ter Tenny, sezee, 'I'm gittin' monst'us tired er dish yer gwine roun' so much. Here I is lent ter Mars Jeems dis month, en I got ter do so en so, en ter Mars Archie de nex' month, en I got ter do so en so, den I got ter go ter Miss Jenny's. En it's Sandy dis en Sandy dat, en Sandy yer en Sandy dere, till it 'pears ter me I ain' got no home, ner no marster, ner no mistress, ner no nuffin. I can't even keep a wife. My other ole 'oman was sole away widout my gittin' a chance fer ter tell her good bye, en now I got ter go off en leave you, Tenny, en I don't know whether I'm eber gwine ter see you ag'in, en no I wish I wuz a tree, er a stump, or a rock, er sump'n w'at could stay on de plantation fer a while." Atter Sandy got th'oo talkin', Tenny didn't say na'er a word, but des sat dere by de fire studyin' en studyin'. Bimeby she up en says, "Sandy, is I eber tole you I was a conjure woman?" Co'se Sandy hadn't neber dreamt er nuffin like dat, en he made a great 'miration w'en he hear w'at Tenny say. Bimeby Tenny went on, "I ain' goofed nobody, ner done no conjure work fer 15 year er mo', en w'en I got religion I made up my min' I wouldn't work no mo' goofer. But dey is some things I don't believe is no sin fer ter do. En ef you don't wanter be sent roun' fum pillar ter pos', en ef you don't wanter go down to Robeson, I kin fix things so you won't hafter. Ef you'll des say de word, I kin turn you to whatever you wanter be, en you kin stay right whar you wanter, ez long ez you min' ter." Sandy say he don't keer, he's willin' fer ter do anythin' fer ter stay close ter Tenny. Den Tenny ax him ef he don't wanter be turnt into a rabbit. Sandy say, "Nah, de dogs mought git atter me." "Shall I turn you to a wolf?" says Tenny. "Nah, eve'ybody's scared er a wolf, en I don't want nobody ter be scared er me." "Shall I turn you to a mockin' bird?" "Nah, a hawk mought ketch me. I wanter be turnt inter sump'n w'at'll stay in one place." "I kin turn you to a tree," says Tenny. "You won't have no mouf ner years, but I kin turn you back oncet in a w'ile, so you can get something to eat and hear what's going on." Well, Sandy say that'll do, and so Tenny took him down by the edge of the swamp, not fur from the quarters, and turned him into a big pine tree, and sawed him out 'mongst some other trees. And the next morning, as some of the field hands was going 'long there, they seed a tree what they didn't 'member having seed before. It was monstrous queer, and they was bleedzd to 'low that they hadn't 'membered right, or else one of the saplings had been growing monstrous fast. When Mars Marrabo 'skivered that Sandy was gone, he 'lowed Sandy had run away. He got the dogs out, but the last place they could track Sandy to was the foot of that pine tree. And there the dogs stood and barked and bayed and pawed at the tree and tried to climb up on it. And when they was took round through the swamp to look for the scent, they broke loose and made for that tree again. It was the beatin'est thing the white folks ever hearn of, and Mars Marrabo 'lowed that Sandy must 'a' climb up on the tree and jump off on a mule or somethin', and rid fur enough fer to spoil the scent. Mars Marrabo wanted to 'cuse some of the other niggers of helping Sandy off, but they all 'nied it to the las', and everybody knowed Tenny sot too much sto' by Sandy fer to help him run away whar she couldn't neber see him no mo'. When Sandy had been gone long enough fer folks to think he done got clean away, Tenny used to go down to the woods at night and turn 'em back, and den they'd slip up to the cabin and set by the fire and talk. But they had to be monst'us careful, or else somebody would 'a' seed 'em, and dat would 'a' spoilt the whole thing. So Tenny alluz turned Sandy back in the mornin' early, befo' anybody was a stirrin'. But Sandy didn't git along widout his trials and tribbilations. One day a woodpecker come along and 'mence' ter peck at the tree, and the nex' time Sandy was turns back he had a little roun' hole in his arm, des lack a sharp stick bin stuck in it. Atter dat, Tenny sot a sparrowhawk fer to watch the tree, and when the woodpecker come along nex' mornin' fer to finish his nes', he got gobble' up mos' 'fo' he stuck his bill in the bark. 'Nudder time Mars Marrabo sent a nigger out in de woods fer to chop turpentine boxes. De man chop a box in dish yer tree en hack de bark up 2 or 3 feet fer to let de turpentine run. De nex' time Sandy was turnt back, he had a big scar on his lef leg, des lack it been skunt, en it tuk Tenny nigh 'bout all night fer to fix a mixtry to cure it up. Atter dat, Tenny sot a hornet fer to watch the tree, en when the nigger come back ag'in fer to cut another box on the other side of the tree, the hornet stung him so hard dat the axe slip en cut his foot nigh 'bout off. When Tenny see so many things happenin' to the tree, she 'cluded she had to turn Sandy to somethin' else, and atter studyin' the matter ober, en talkin' wid Sandy one evenin', she made up her min' fer to fix up a goopher mixtry w'at would turn herself en Sandy to foxes, er somethin', so dey could run away en go somewheres whar dey could be free en lib like w'ite folks. But dey ain' no tellin' w'at's gwine happen in dis worl'. Tenny had got the night sot fer her en Sandy to run away, when dat ve'y day one er Mars Marrabo's sons rid up to the big house in his buggy, en say his wife was monst'us sick, en he want his mammy to len' him a woman fer to nuss his wife. Tenny's mistiss say sen' Tenny, she was a good nuss. Young Mars was in a tarrible hurry fer to git back home. Tenny was washin' at the big house dat day, en her mistiss say she should go right along wid her young massa. Tenny tried to make some 'scuse fer to git away en hide till night, when she would have eve'ything fixed up fer her en Sandy. She say she want to go to her cabin fer to git her bonnet. Her mistiss say it don't matter 'bout the bonnet. Her head hankcher was good enough. Den Tenny say she want to git her best frock. Her mistiss say no, she don't need no mo' frock, en when dat one got dirty she could git a clean one where she was gwine. So Tenny had to git in the buggy en go 'long wid young Mars Dunkin to his plantation, which was mo' d'n 20 mile away, en dey wa'n't no chance er her seein' Sandy no mo' till she come back home. De po' gal felt monst'us bad 'bout de way things was gwine on, en she knowed Sandy mus' be a wonderin' why she didn't come turnin' back no mo'. W'iles Tenny was away nussin' young Mars Dunkin's wife, Mars Marrabo tuk a notion fer to buil' him a new kitchen, and being as he had lots of timber on his place, he begun to look round for a tree to have the lumber sawed outen. And I don't know how it come to be so, but it happened for to hit on the very tree what Sandy was turns into. Tenny was gone, and they wa'n't nobody ner nuffin for to watch the tree. The two men what cut the tree down say they never had such a time with a tree befo'. They axes would glance off, and didn't 'pear to make no progress through the wood. And of all the creakin' and shakin' and wobblin' you eber see, that tree done it when it commenced to fall. It was de beatin'est thing. When they got the tree all trim' up, they chain it up to a timber wagon, and start for the sawmill. But they had a hard time getting a log there. First they got stuck in the mud when they was going 'cross the swamp, and it was 2 or 3 hours before they could get it out. When they start on again, the chain kep' a comin' loose, and they had to keep a stoppin' and a stoppin' for to hitch the log up again. When they commenced to climb the hill to the sawmill, the log broke loose and rolled down the hill in amongst the trees, and it took nigh about half a day mo' to get it hauled up to the sawmill. The next mornin', after the day the tree was hauled to the sawmill, Tenny come home. When she got back to her cabin, the fust thing she done was to run down to the woods and see how Sandy was getting on. When she seed the stump standing there, with the sap running out'n it and the limbs layin' scattered round, she nigh about went out'n her mind. She run to her cabin and got a gopher mixtry, and then followed the track of the timber wagon to the sawmill. She knowed Sandy couldn't live mo' d'n a minute or so if she turns him back, for he was all chop' up, so he'd 'a' been bleedst to die. But she wanted to turn him back long enough fer to 'splain to him that she hadn't went off a purpose, and lef' him to be chopped down and sawed up. She didn't want Sandy to die with no hard feelin's to'ds her. The hands at the sawmill had jest got the big log on the carriage, and was startin' up the saw when they seed a woman runnin' up the hill, all out of breath, cryin' and goin' on jest like she was plumb 'stracted. It was Tenny. She come right into the mill, and throwed herself on the log, right in front of the saw, a hollerin' and cryin' to her Sandy to fergive her, and not to think hard of her, for it wa'n't no fault of her'n. Den Tenny 'membered the tree didn't have no years, and she was gettin' ready fer to work her gopher mixtry so as to turn Sandy back, when the mill hands cotch holt of her and tied her arms with a rope, and fastened her to one of the posts in the sawmill. And then they started to saw up again, and cut the log up into boards and scantlings right before her eyes. But it was mighty hard work, for of all the sweekin' and moanin' and groanin', that log done it whiles the saw was a cuttin' through it. The saw was one of these yer old timey up and down saws, and it took longer them days to saw a log 'en it do now. They greased the saw, but that didn't stop the fuss. It kep' right on, till finally they got the log all sawed up. When the oberseah what run the sawmill come from breakfast, the hands up and tell him 'bout the crazy woman, as they s'posed she was, what had come running in the sawmill, a hollerin' and goin' on, and tried to throw herself before the saw. And the overseer sent 2 or 3 of the hands fer to take Tenny back to her marster's plantation. Tenny 'peared to be out'n her mind fer a long time, and her marster had to lock her up in the smoke house till she got over her spells. Mars Marrabo was monst'us mad, and it would 'a' made yo' flesh crawl fer to hear him cuss, 'cause he say the speculator w'at he got Tenny from had fooled him by wuckin' a crazy woman off on him. Whilst Tenny was lock' up in the smoke house, Mars Marrabo took and hauled the lumber from the sawmill and put up his new kitchen. When Tenny got quiet down, so she could be 'lowed to go round the plantation, she up and tole her marster all about Sandy and the pine tree, and when Mars Marrabo hearn it, he 'lowed she was the wust 'stracted nigger he eber hearn of. He didn't know what to do wid Tenny. Fust he thought he'd put her in the po'house, but finally, seein' as she didn't do no harm to nobody ner nuffin, but jest went around moanin' and groanin' and shakin' her head, he 'cluded to let her stay on the plantation and nuss the little nigger chilluns when they mammies was to work in the cotton field. The new kitchen Mars Marrabo built wasn't much use, for it hadn't been put up long before the niggers 'mence' to notice queer things about it. Dey could hear somethin' moanin' en groanin' 'bout in de kitchen in de night time, en w'en de win' would blow, dey could hear somethin' a hollerin' en squeakin' lack it was in great pain en sufferin'. En it got so atter a w'ile dat it was all Mars Marrabo's wife could do ter git a woman ter stay in de kitchen in de daytime long enough ter do de cookin'. En dey wa'n't na'er nigger on de plantation w'at wouldn't rudder take 40 den ter go 'bout dat kitchen atter dark. Dat is, 'ceptin' Tenny. She didn't 'pear ter min' de ha'nts. She useter slip roun' at night en set on de kitchen steps en lean up 'gins de do' jamb en run on ter herse'f wid some kinder foolishness w'at nobody couldn't make out, fer Mars Marrabo had th'eatened ter sen' her off'n de plantation ef she say anythin' ter any er de other niggers 'bout de pine tree. But somehow er udder de niggers foun' out all about it, en dey all knowed de kitchen wuz ha'nted by Sandy's sperrit. En bimeby it got so Mars Marrabo's wife herse'f wuz scared ter go out in de yard atter dark. W'en it come ter dat, Mars Marrabo tuk en to' de kitchen down, en used de lumber fer ter built dat ole schoolhouse w'at you were talkin' 'bout pullin' down. De schoolhouse wuz in use 'ceptin' in de daytime, en on dark nights folks gwine 'long de road would hear queer sounds en see queer things. Po' ole Tenny useter go down dere at night en wander roun' de schoolhouse, en de niggers all 'lowed she went fer ter talk wid Sandy's sperrit. En one winter mawnin', w'en one er de boys went ter school early fer ter start de fire, w'at should he fin' but po' ole Tenny layin' on de flo', stiff en cole en dead. Dey didn' 'pear ter be nuffin partic'lar de matter wid her. She had des grieve' herse'f ter death fer her Sandy. Mars Marrabo didn' shed no tears. He thought Tenny wuz crazy, en dey wa'n't no tellin' w'at she mought do nex', en dey ain' much room in dis worl' fer crazy w'ite folks, let alone a crazy nigger. It wa'n't long atter dat befo' Mars Marrabo sol' a piece er his trac' of lan' ter Mars Dugal' McAdoo, my ole marster, en dat's how de ole schoolhouse happen' ter be on yo' place. W'en de wah broke out, de school stop', en de ole schoolhouse be'n stannin' empty ever sence, dat is, 'cep'n' fer de ha'nts. En folks says dat de ole schoolhouse, er any yuther house w'at got any er dat lumber in it w'at wuz sawed out'n de tree w'at Sandy wuz turnt inter, is gwine ter be ha'nted till de las' piece er plank is rotted en crumble inter dus'." Annie had listened to this gruesome narrative with strained attention. What a system it was, she exclaimed, when Julius had finished, under which such things were possible. "What things?" I asked in amazement. "Are you seriously considering the possibility of a man's being turned into a tree?" "Oh, no," she replied quickly, "not that." And then she murmured absently, and with a dim look in her fine eyes, "Poor Tenny." We ordered the lumber and returned home. That night, after we had gone to bed, and my wife had to all appearances been sound asleep for half an hour, she startled me out of an incipient doze by exclaiming suddenly, "John, I don't believe I want my new kitchen built out of the lumber in that old schoolhouse." "You wouldn't for a moment allow yourself," I replied with some asperity, "to be influenced by that absurdly impossible yarn which Julius was spinning to day." "I know the story is absurd," she replied dreamily, "and I am not so silly as to believe it. But I don't think I should ever be able to take any pleasure in that kitchen if it were built out of that lumber. Besides, I think the kitchen would look better and last longer if the lumber were all new." Of course she had her way. I bought the new lumber, though not without grumbling. A week or two later I was called away from home on business. On my return, after an absence of several days, my wife remarked to me, "John, there has been a split in the Sandy Run Colored Baptist Church on the temperance question. About half the members have come out from the main body, and set up for themselves. Uncle Julius is one of the seceders, and he came to me yesterday and asked if they might not hold their meetings in the old schoolhouse for the present." "I hope you didn't let the old rascal have it," I returned with some warmth. I had just received a bill for the new lumber I had bought. "Well," she replied, "I couldn't refuse him the use of the house for so good a purpose." "And I'll venture to say," I continued, "that you subscribe something toward the support of the new church?" She did not attempt to deny it. "What are they going to do about the ghost?" I asked, somewhat curious to know how Julius would get around this obstacle. "Oh," replied Annie, "Uncle Julius says that ghosts never disturb religious worship, but that if Sandy's spirit should happen to stray into meeting by mistake, no doubt the preaching would do it good." End of Post Sandy. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 3 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 3 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Moz Jeem's Nightmare. We found old Julius very useful when we moved to our new residence. He had a thorough knowledge of the neighborhood, was familiar with the roads and the watercourses, knew the qualities of the various soils and what they would produce, and where the best hunting and fishing were to be had. He was a marvelous hand in the management of horses and dogs, with whose mental processes he manifested a greater familiarity than mere use would seem to account for, though it was doubtless due to the simplicity of a life that had kept him close to nature. Toward my tract of land and the things that were on it, the creeks, the swamps, the hills, the meadows, the stones, the trees, he maintained a peculiar personal attitude that might be called predial rather than proprietary. He had been accustomed, until long after middle life, to look upon himself as the property of another. When this relation was no longer possible, owing to the war and to his master's death and the dispersion of the family, he had been unable to break off entirely the mental habits of a lifetime, but had attached himself to the old plantation, of which he seemed to consider himself an appurtenance. We found him useful in many ways and entertaining in others, and my wife and I took quite a fancy to him. Shortly after we became established in our home on the sand hills, Julius brought up to the house one day a colored boy of about 17, whom he introduced as his grandson, and for whom he solicited employment. I was not favorably impressed by the youth's appearance, quite the contrary, in fact. But mainly to please the old man I hired Tom, his name was Tom, to help about the stables, weed the garden, cut wood and bring water, and in general to make himself useful about the outdoor work of the household. My first impression of Tom proved to be correct. He turned out to be very trifling, and I was much annoyed by his laziness, his carelessness, and his apparent lack of any sense of responsibility. I kept him longer than I should, on Julius's account, hoping that he might improve, but he seemed to grow worse instead of better, and when I finally reached the limit of my patience, I discharged him. "I am sorry, Julius," I said to the old man. "I should have liked to oblige you by keeping him, but I can't stand Tom any longer. He is absolutely untrustworthy." "Yes, sah," replied Julius, with a deep sigh and a long shake of the head. "I knows he ain't much account, and dey ain't much dependence to be put on 'im, but I was hopin' dat you mought make some allowance for a ignorant young nigger, sah, and give 'im one mo' chance." But I had hardened my heart. I had always been too easily imposed upon, and had suffered too much from this weakness. I determined to be firm as a rock in this instance. "No, Julius," I rejoined decidedly, "it is impossible. I gave him more than a fair trial, and he simply won't do." When my wife and I set out for our drive in the cool of the evening (afternoon is evening in Southern parlance), one of the servants put into the rockaway 2 large earthenware jugs. Our drive was to be down through the swamp, to the mineral spring at the foot of the sandhills beyond. The water of this spring was strongly impregnated with sulphur and iron, and, while not particularly agreeable of smell or taste, was used by us in moderation for sanitary reasons. When we reached the spring we found a man engaged in cleaning it out. In answer to an inquiry, he said that if we would wait 5 or 10 minutes his task would be finished, and the spring in such condition that we could fill our jugs. We might have driven on and come back by way of the spring, but there was a bad stretch of road beyond, and we concluded to remain where we were until the spring should be ready. We were in a cool and shady place. It was often necessary to wait a while in North Carolina, and our Northern energy had not been entirely proof against the influences of climate and local custom. While we sat there, a man came suddenly around a turn of the road ahead of us. I recognized in him a neighbor with whom I had exchanged formal calls. He was driving a horse, apparently a high-spirited creature, possessing, so far as I could see at a glance, the marks of good temper and good breeding. The gentleman, I had heard it suggested, was slightly deficient in both. The horse was rearing and plunging, and the man was beating him furiously with a buggy whip. When he saw us, he flushed a fiery red, and as he passed, held the reins with one hand, at some risk to his safety, lifted his hat, and bowed somewhat constrainedly as the horse darted by us, still panting and snorting with fear. "He looks as though he were ashamed of himself," I observed. "I'm sure he ought to be," exclaimed my wife indignantly. "I think there is no worse sin, and no more disgraceful thing than cruelty." "I quite agree with you," I assented. "A man w'at 'buses his hoss is gwine be hard on de folks w'at wukes fer 'im," remarked Julius. "Ef young Mistah McLean don't min', he'll hab a bad dream one dese yer days, jes' like his gran'daddy had, way back yander, long years befo' de wah." "What was it about Mr. McLean's dream, Julius?" I asked. The man had not yet finished cleaning the spring, and we might as well put in time listening to Julius as in any other way. We had found some of his plantation tales quite interesting. "Mars Jeems McLean," said Julius, "was de gran'daddy er dis yer gentleman w'at is jes' gone by us beatin' his hoss. He had a big plantation and a heap er niggers. Mars Jeems was a hard man, and monst'us strict wid his hands. Eber sence he growed up, he neber 'peared to have no feelin' fer nobody. W'en his daddy, ole Mars John McLean, died, de plantation and all de niggers fell to young Mars Jeems. He had be'n bad 'nuff befo', but it wa'n't long afterwards 'tel it got so dey wuz no use in libbin' at all ef you had ter lib roun' Mars Jeems. His niggers wuz bleedzd ter slave fum daylight ter dark, w'iles de yuther folks didn' have ter wuk 'cep'n' fum sun ter sun. En dey didn' git no mo' ter eat dan dey oughter, en dat de co'ses' kin'. Dey wa'n't 'lowed ter sing, ner dance, ner play de banjo w'en Mars Jeems wuz roun' de place, fer Mars Jeems say he wouldn't have no sech gwines on, said he bought his hands ter wuk, en not ter play. En w'en night come, dey mus' sleep en res', so dey'd be ready ter git up soon in de mawnin' en go ter wuk fresh en strong. Mars Jeems didn' 'low no co'tin' er junesin' roun' his plantation, said he wanted his niggers ter put dey min's on dey wuk, en not be wastin' dey time wid no sech foolishness. En he wouldn' let his hands git mad, said he wa'n't raisin' niggers, but wuz raisin' cotton. En w'eneber any er de boys en gals had 'mence' ter git sweet on one anudder, he'd sell one er de udder un 'em, er sen' 'em way down in Robeson County ter his udder plantation, whar dey couldn't neber see one anudder. Ef any er de niggers eber complained, dey got 40, so co'se dey didn't many un 'em complain. But dey didn't lack it, des de same, en nobody couldn't blame 'em, fer dey had a hard time. Mars Jeems didn't make no 'lowance fer nat'ral bawn laziness, ner sickness, ner trouble in de min', ner nuffin. He wuz des gwine git so much wuk out er eve'y han', er know de reason why. Dey wuz one time de niggers 'lowed fer a spell dat Mars Jeems might git better. He tuk a likin' ter Mars Marrabo McSwain's oldest gal, Miss Libbie, and used to go over there every day or every evening, and folks said they was gwine to get married sho'. But it appears that Miss Libbie heard 'bout de goin's on Mars Jeems's plantation, and she jes' 'lowed she couldn't trust herself wid no such a man, dat he might get so used to abusin' his niggers dat he'd 'mence to abuse his wife after he got used to havin' her aroun' de house. So she declared she wa'n't gwine to have nuffin mo' to do wid young Mars Jeems. De niggers was all monst'us sorry w'en de match was bus' up, fer now Mars Jeems got wusser'n he was befo' he started sweetheartin'. De time he used to spen' co'tin' Miss Libbie, he put in findin' fault wid de niggers, en all his bad feelin's 'cause Miss Libbie throwed him ober, he 'peared to try to wuk off on de po' niggers. W'iles Mars Jeems was co'tin' Miss Libbie, two er de hens on de plantation had got ter settin' a heap er sto' by one anudder. One of 'em was name' Solomon, en de udder was a 'oman w'at wuked in de fiel' longer'n I am. I fergit dat 'oman's name, but it don't 'mount ter much in de tale nohow. Now whether 'cause Mars Jeems was so tuck up wid his own junesey, sweetheart, dat he didn't pay no 'tention fer a w'ile ter w'at wuz gwine on 'twixt Solomon en his junesey, or whether his own co'tin' made him kinder easy on de co'tin' in de quarters, dey ain' no tellin'. But dey is one thing sho', dat w'en Miss Libbie throwed him ober, he foun' out 'bout Solomon en de gal monst'us quick, en gun Solomon 40, en sont de gal down ter de Robeson County plantation, en tole all de niggers ef he ketch 'em at any mo' such foolishness, he wuz gwine ter skin 'em alive en tan dey hides befo' dey ve'y eyes. Co'se he wouldn't 'a' done it, but it might 'a' made things wusser'n dey wuz, so you kin 'magine dey wa'n't much love makin' in de quarters fer a long time. Mars Jeems used to go down ter de other plantations sometimes fer a week er mo', en so he had to hire a oberseer ter look atter his wuk w'ile he 'uz gone. Mars Jeems' oberseer was a po' w'ite man name' Nick Johnson. De niggers called 'im Mars Johnson ter his face, but behin' his back dey used ter call 'im Ole Nick, en de name suited 'im ter a T. He wuz wusser'n Mars Jeems ever dared ter be. Co'se de darkies didn' like de way Mars Jeems use' 'em, but he wuz de marster, en had a right ter do ez he please'. But dis yer Ole Nick wa'n't nuffin but a po' buckra, en all de niggers 'spised 'im ez much ez dey hated 'im, but he didn't own nobody, en wa'n't no better 'n a nigger, fer in dem days any 'spectable pusson would ruther be a nigger dan a po' w'ite man. Now atter Solomon's gal had be'n sont away, he kep' feelin' mo' en mo' bad erbout it, 'tel fin'lly he 'lowed he wuz gwine ter see ef dey couldn't be sump'n done fer ter git her back, en ter make Mars Jeems treat de darkies better. So he tuk a peck er cotton out de barn one night, en went ober ter see ole Aun' Peggy, de free nigger 'Cajun 'oman down by de Wilmington Road. Aun' Peggy listened to his tale, en ax' him some questions, en den tole 'im she would wuk her roots en see w'at dey'd say 'bout it, en termorrer night he should come back ag'in en fetch anudder peck er co'n, en den she'd hab sump'n fer ter tell 'im. So Solomon went back de nex' night, en sho' 'nuff Aun' Peggy tole 'im w'at ter do. She gun 'im some stuff w'at look like it be'n made by poundin' up some roots en yerbs wid a pestle en a mortar. "Dis yer stuff," says she, "is monst'us powerful kinder goopher. You take dis home en gin it ter de cook, ef you kin trus' her, en tell her fer ter put it in yo' marster's soup de fus' cloudy day he have okra soup fer dinner. Min' you follow de directions. It ain' gwine ter poison 'em, is it?" Solomon gittin' kinder scared, fer Solomon wuz a good man, en didn' want ter do nobody no real harm. "Oh, no," says ole Aun' Peggy, "it's gwine ter do 'im good, but he'll hab a monst'us bad dream fus'. A month fum now you come down here en lemme know how de goopher is wukkin', fer I ain' done much er dis kinder conjurin' er late years, en I has ter kinder keep track on it ter see dat it don't 'complish no more'n I 'lows fer it ter do. En I has ter be kinder keerful 'bout conjurin' w'ite folks, so be sho' en lemme know w'atever you do, des w'at is gwine on roun' de plantation." So Solomon say all right, en tuk de goopher mixtry up ter de big house, en gun it ter de cook, en tole her fer ter put it in Mars Jeems' soup de fus' cloudy day she have okra soup fer dinner. It happen' dat de ve'y nex' day wuz a cloudy day, en so de cook made okra soup fer Mars Jeems' dinner, and put the powder Solomon gunner into the soup, and made the soup real good, so Mars Jeems eat a whole lot of it and 'peared to enjoy it. The next morning Mars Jeems told the overseer he was gwine away on some business, and then he was gwine to his other plantation down in Robeson County, and he didn't expect he'd be back for a month or so. "But," says he, "I want you to run this here plantation for all it's wuth. These here niggers is getting monstrous trifling and lazy and careless, and they ain't no dependence to be put in 'em. I wants that stop, and whiles I'm gone away, I wants the 'spenses cut way down and a heap mo' work done. Fact, I want this here plantation to make a record that'll show what kind of overseer you is." Old Nick didn't say nuffin but "Yes, suh," but de way he kinder grinned to hisse'f and show his big yeller teef and snap de rawhide he use' ter carry roun' wid 'im, made cold chills run up and down de backbone er dem niggers w'at heared Mars Jeems a talkin'. En dat night dey was moanin' en groanin' down in de quarters, fer de niggers all knowed w'at was comin'. So, sho' 'nuff, Mars Jeems went away nex' mornin', en de trouble begun. Mars Johnson sta'ted off de ve'y fus' day fer ter see w'at he could have ter show Mars Jeems w'en he come back. He made de tasks bigger en de rashuns littler, en w'en de niggers had worked all day, he'd fin' sump'n fer ter do roun' de barn er somewheres atter dark, fer ter keep 'em busy a hour er so befo' dey went ter sleep. 'Bout 3 or 4 days atter Mars Jeems went away, young Mars Duncan McSwain rode up to de big house one day wid a nigger settin' behin' him in de buggy, tied to de seat, en ax' ef Mars Jeems wuz home. Mars Johnson was at de house, en he say no. "Well," says Mars Duncan, says he, "I fotched dis nigger ober ter Mr. McLean fer ter pay a bet I made wid him las' week w'en we wuz playin' kyards tergedder. I bet him a nigger man, en here's one I reckon'll fill de bill. He wuz tuk up de yuther day fer a stray nigger, en he couldn't give no 'count er hisse'f, en so he wuz sol' at auction, en I bought 'im. He's kinder brash, but I knows yo' powers, Mr. Johnson, en I reckon ef anybody kin make 'em toe de mark, you is de man." Mars Johnson grinned one er dem grins w'at show all his snagger teef, en make de niggers 'low he look like de ole Deborah, en says he ter Mars Duncan, "I reckon you kin trus' me, Mr. Duncan, fer ter tame any nigger wuz ever bawn. De nigger don't live w'at I can't take down in 'bout 4 days." Well, ole Nick had his hands full 'long er dat noo nigger, en w'iles de rest er de darkies wuz sorry fer de po' man, dey 'lowed he kep' Mars Johnson so busy dat dey got along better d'n dey'd 'a' done ef de noo nigger had never come. De fus thing dat happen', Mars Johnson says ter dis yer noo man, "W'at's yo' name, Sambo?" "My name ain't Sambo," 'spon' de noo nigger. "Did I ax you w'at yo' name wasn't?" says Mars Johnson. "You wants ter be particular how you talks ter me. Now w'at is yo' name, en whar did you come fum?" "I don't know my name," says the nigger, "en I don't 'member whar I come fum. My head is all kinder mix' up." "Yas," says Mars Johnson, "I reckon I'll ha' ter give you sump'n fer ter clar yo' head. At de same time it'll l'arn you some manners, en atter dis, maybe you'll say 'suh' w'en you speaks ter me." Well, Mars Johnson haul off wid his rawhide en hit de noo nigger once. De noo man look at Mars Johnson fer a minute ez ef he didn't know w'at ter make er dis yer kinder l'arnin'. But w'en de oberseer raise' his whip ter hit 'im ag'in, de noo nigger des haul off en made fer Mars Johnson, en ef some er de other niggers hadn't stop' 'im, it 'pears ez ef it mought 'a' made it warm fer ole Nick dere fer a w'ile. But de oberseer made de other niggers he'p tie de noo nigger up, en den gun 'im 40 wid a dozen er so throwed in fer good measure, fer ole Nick wuz nebber stingy wid dem kinder rashuns. De nigger went on at a tarrible rate, des like a wil' man, but co'se he wuz bleedst ter take his medicine, fer he wuz tied up en couldn't he'p hisse'f. Mars Johnson locked de noo nigger up in de barn, en didn't give 'im nuffin ter eat fer a day er so, 'tel he got 'im kinder quiet down, en den he tu'nt 'im loose en put 'im ter wuk. De nigger 'lowed he wa'n't use' ter wukkin', en wouldn't wuk, en Mars Johnson gun 'im anudder 40 fer laziness en impidence, en let 'im fas' a day er so mo', and then put him to work again. The nigger went to work, but didn't 'pear to know how to handle a hoe. It took just 'bout half the overseer's time looking after him, and that po' nigger got more lashings and cussings and cuffings than any 4 others on the plantation. He didn't mix with nor talk much to the rest of the niggers, and couldn't 'pear to get through his mind that he was a slave, and had to work and mind the white folks, spite of the fact that old Nick gun him a lesson every day. And finally Mars Johnson 'lowed that he couldn't do nuffin with him, that if he was his nigger he'd break his spirit or break his neck, one or the other. But course he was only sont over on trial, and as he didn't give satisfaction, and he hadn't heard from Mars Jeems 'bout when he was comin' back, and as he was feared he'd get mad some time or 'nother and kill a nigger before he knowed it, he 'lowed he'd better send him back where he come from. So he tied him up and sont him back to Mars Duncan. Now Mars Duncan McSwain was one of these here easy goin' gentlemen, what didn't like to hate no trouble with niggers or nobody else, and he knowed if Mars old Nick couldn't git along with his nigger, nobody could. So he took the nigger to town that same day, and sold him to a trader what was getting up a gang of likely niggers for to ship off on the steamboat to go down the river to Wimberton, and from there to New Orleans. The next day, after the new man had been sent away, Solomon was working in the cotton field, and when he got to the fence next to the woods, at the end of the row, who should he see on the other side but old Aunt Peggy. She beckoned to him, the overseer was down on the other side of the field, and says she, "Why ain't you done come and 'ported to me like I tole you?" "Why, law, Aunt Peggy," says Solomon, "dey ain't nuffin to 'port. Mars Jeems went away day atter we gun 'im the goopher mixtry, en we ain't seen hide ner hair on 'im sence. En co'se we don't know nuffin 'bout w'at 'fect it had on 'im. I don't care nuffin 'bout yo' Mars Jeems now. W'at I wants to know is w'at has be'n gwine on 'mongs' the niggers. Has you be'n gittin' 'long any better on the plantation?" "No, Aunt Peggy, we be'n gittin' 'long wusser. Mars Johnson is stricter'n he eber wuz befo', en de po' niggers don't hardly get time to draw dey breff, en dey 'lows dey might des ez well be dead ez alive." "Uh-huh," says Aunt Peggy, says she. "I tole you dat is monst'us powerful goopher, en its wuk don't 'pear all at once. Long ez we had dat new nigger here," Solomon went on, "he kep' Mars Johnson busy part de time, but now he's gone away, I s'pose de res' un us'll ketch it wusser'n eber." "W'at's gone wid de new nigger?" says Aunt Peggy, rale quick, battin' her eyes en straightening up. "Ole Nick done sont 'im back ter Mars Duncan, who had fotch 'im here fer ter pay a gamblin' debt ter Mars Jeems," says Solomon, "en I hear Mars Duncan has sol' 'im to a nigger trader up in Patesville, w'at's gwine ter ship 'im off wid a gang termorrer." Ole Aunt Peggy 'peared to get rale stirred up w'en Solomon tole her dat, en says she, shaking her stick at him, "Why didn't you come en tell me 'bout dis new nigger bein' sol' away? Didn't you promise me ef I give you dat goopher you'd come en 'pote to me 'bout all w'at's gwine on dis plantation? Co'se I could 'a' foun' out fer myse'f, but I 'pended on yo' tellin' me, en now by not doin' it I's feared you gwine spile my conjurin'. You come down ter my house ter night en do w'at I tells you, or I'll put a spell on you dat'll make yo' hair fall out so you'll be bal', en yo' eyes drap out so you can't see, en yo' teef fall out so you can't eat, en yo' years grow up so you can't hear. W'en you is foolin' wid a conjure woman like me, you gotter min' yo' P's en Q's, or dere'll be trouble sho' 'nuff." So, co'se, Solomon went down to Aunt Peggy's dat night, en she got 'im a roasted sweet'n' 'tater. "You take dis yer sweet'n' 'tater," says she, "I done goophered it speshly fer dat nigger, so you bet not eat it yo'self or you'll wush you had'n'. En slip off ter town en fin' dat strange man en give 'im dis yer sweet'n' 'tater. He mus' eat it befo' mornin' sho', ef he don't wanter be sol' away ter New Orleans." "But s'posen de patter rollers ketch me, Aunt Peggy, w'at I gwine ter do?" says Solomon. "De patter rollers ain' gwine tech you, but ef you don't fin' dat nigger I'm gwine git you, en you'll fin' me wusser'n de patter rollers. Des hol' on a minute, and I'll sprinkle you with some of this mixture out in this yer bottle, so the patter rollers can't see you. And you can rub your feet with some of this here grease out in this gourd, so you can run fast, and rub some of it in your eyes so you can see in the dark. And then you must find that new nigger and give him this here tater, or you're going to have more trouble on your hands than you ever had before in your life, or ever will have since." So Solomon took the sweetened tater and started up the road fast as he could go, and before long he reached town. He went right along by the patter rollers, and they didn't 'pear to notice him. And by he found where the strange nigger was kept, and he walked right past the guard at the door and found him. The nigger couldn't see him, of course, and he couldn't 'a' seen the nigger in the dark if it hadn't been for the stuff Aunt Peggy gun him to rub on his eyes. The nigger was laying in a cornder, asleep, and Solomon just slip up to him and hilt dat sweetened tater for the nigger's nose, and he just naturally retch up with his hand and took the tater and eat it in his sleep without knowing it. When Solomon seed he done eat the tater, he went back and told Aunt Peggy, and then went home to his cabin to sleep, way along 'bout 2 o'clock in the morning. The next day was Sunday, and so the niggers had a little time to theirselves. Solomon was kind of 'sturbed in his mind thinking 'bout his Junesy what is gone away, and wondering what Aunt Peggy had to do with that new nigger, and he had sauntered up in the woods so's to be by hisself a little, and at the same time to look at the rabbit trap he'd sot down in the edge of the swamp, when who should he see standing under a tree but a white man. Solomon didn't know the white man at first, till the white man spoke up to him. "Is that you, Solomon?" says he. Then Solomon recognized the voice. "For the law's sake, Mars Jeems, is that you?" "Yes, Solomon," says his master, "dis is me, er what's left of me." It wasn't no wonder Solomon hadn't known Mars Jeems at first, for he was dressed like a po' white man, and was barefooted, and looked monstrous pale and peaked, as if he'd just come through a hard spell of sickness. "You are looking kind of po'ly, Mars Jeems," says Solomon. "Is you been sick, suh?" "No, Solomon," says Mars Jeems, shaking his head and speaking sort of slow and sad, "I ain' been sick, but I's had a monstrous bad dream. Fact, a reg'lar natchel nightmare. But tell me how things has been going up to the plantation sence I been gone, Solomon." So Solomon up and told him 'bout the crops, and 'bout the hosses and the mules, and 'bout the cows and the hogs, and when he 'mence to tell him 'bout the new nigger, Mars Jeems prick up his years and listen, and every now and den he say, "Uh-huh, mm-huh," and nod his head, and by, when he'd ax Solomon some mo' questions, he says he, "Now, Solomon, I don't want you to say a word to nobody 'bout meetin' me here, but I want you to slip up to the house and fetch me some clothes and some shoes. I forgot to tell you dat a man robbed me back yonder on the road and swapped clothes with me without axing me whether or no. But you neenter say nuffin 'bout dat nuther. You go and fetch me some clothes here, so nobody won't see you, and keep your mouf shut, and I'll give you $1." Solomon was so 'stonished he lack to fell over in his tracks when Mars Jeems promised to give him $1. Dey suttinly was a change come over Mars Jeems when he offer one of his niggers dat much money. Solomon 'mence to 'spect dat Aunt Peggy's cunjation had been workin' monst'us strong. Solomon fotch Mars Jeems some clothes and shoes, and dat same ebenin' Mars Jeems 'peared at de house and let on like he des dat minute got home from Robeson County. Mars Johnson was all ready to talk to him, but Mars Jeems sot him word he wa'n't feelin' very well dat night, and he'd see him termorrer. So nex' mawnin', atter breakfas', Mars Jeems sont fer de oberseer, and ax' him fer to give 'count er his stewardship. Ole Nick tol' Mars Jeems how much work been done, and got de books and showed 'im how much money been save'. Den Mars Jeems ax' him how de darkies been behavin', and Mars Johnson say dey been behavin' good, most of 'em, and dem w'at didn't behave good at fus' changed dey conduc' atter he got holt of 'em a time er two. "All," says he, "'cep'n' de new nigger Mr. Duncan fotch ober here and lef' on trial w'iles you was gone." "Ah, yas," 'lows Mars Jeems, Tell me all 'bout dat new nigger. I heard a little 'bout dat queer new nigger las' night, en it wuz des too ridiculous. Tell me all 'bout dat new nigger.' So, seein' Mars Jeems so good natured 'bout it, Mars Johnson up en tole 'im how he tied up de new han' de fus' day, en gun 'im 40 'ca'se he wouldn' tell 'im his name. 'Ha, ha, ha!' says Mars Jeems, laughin' fit ter kill, 'but dat is too funny fer any use. Tell me some mo' 'bout dat new nigger.' So Mars Johnson went on en tole 'im how he had ter starbe de new nigger 'fo' he could make 'im take holt er a hoe. 'Dat wuz de beatenis' notion fer a nigger,' says Mars Jeems, puttin' on airs des lack he wuz a w'ite man, 'en I reckon you didn' do nuffin ter 'im.' 'Oh, no, suh,' says de oberseah, grinnin' like a cheesy cat, 'I didn' do nuffin but take de hide off'n 'im.' Mars Jeems laughed en laughed, 'tel it 'peared lack he wuz gwine ter bus'. 'Tell me some mo' 'bout dat new nigger, oh, tell me some mo'. Dat new nigger int'rusts me, he do, en dat is a fac'.' Mars Johnson didn' quite understan' why Mars Jeems should make such a great 'miration 'bout de new nigger, but co'se he want ter please de gentleman w'at hired 'im, en so he 'splain all 'bout how many times he had to cowhide de new nigger, en how he made 'im do tasks twice ez big ez some er de other hands, en how he'd chain 'im up in de barn at night en feed 'im on corn bread en water. 'Oh, but you wuz a monst'us good oberseah, you wuz de bes' oberseah in dis county, Mistah Johnson,' says Mars Jeems, w'en de oberseah got th'oo wid his tale, 'en dey ain' neber be'n no nigger breaker like you roun' here befo'. En you deserbs great credit fer sendin' dat nigger 'way befo' you spilt 'im fer de market. Fac', you is such a monst'us good oberseah, en you is got dis yer plantation in such fine shape dat I reckon I don't need you no mo'. You is got dese yer darkies so well train' dat I 'spec' I kin run 'em myse'f fum dis time on. But I does wish you had 'a hilt on ter dat new nigger 'tel I got home, fer I'd 'a like ter seed 'im, I cert'nly should.' De oberseah wuz so 'stonish' he didn' hardly know w'at ter say, but fin'lly he ax' Mars Jeems ef he wouldn' give 'im a recommend fer ter git 'im anudder place. 'No, suh,' says Mars Jeems, 'somehow er 'nother I don't like yo' looks sence I come back dis time, en I'd much ruther you wouldn' stay roun' here. Fac', I's feared ef I'd meet you 'lone in de woods sometime I mought wanter harm you. But layin' dat aside, I be'n lookin' ober dese yer books er yo'n w'at you kep' w'ile I wuz away, en fer a year er so back, en dere's some figgers w'at ain' des clear ter me. I ain' got no time fer ter talk erbout 'em now, but I 'spec' befo' I settles wid you fer dis las' mont', you better come up here termorrer, atter I's looked de books en counts ober some mo', en den we'll straighten our business all up.' Mars Jeems 'lowed atterwards dat he wuz des shootin' in de dark w'en he said dat 'bout de books, but howsomeber, Mars Nick Johnson lep dat neighborhood 'twix' de nex' 2 suns, en nobody roun' here neber seed hidin' a hair of 'im sence. En all de darkies thank' de Lawd en 'lowed it wuz a good riddance er bad rubbage. But all dem things I done tole you ain' nuffin 'cidin' de change w'at come ober Mars Jeems fum dat time on. Aun' Peggy's goopher had made a new man er 'im enti'ely. De nex' day atter he come back, he tole de hands dey near'n ter work only fum sun to sun, en he cut dey tasks down so dey didn' nobody have ter stan' ober 'em wid a rawhide or a hickory. En he 'lowed ef de niggers wanter hab a dance in de big barn any Sad'day night, dey mought hab it. En bimeby, w'en Solomon seed how good Mars Jeems wuz, he ax' 'im ef he wouldn' please sen' down ter de udder plantation fer his junesey. Mars Jeems say suttinly, en gun Solomon a pass en a note ter de oberseah on de udder plantation, en sont Solomon down ter Robeson County wid a hoss en buggy fer ter fetch his junesey back. W'en de niggers see how fine Mars Jeems gwine treat 'em, dey all tuk ter sweetheartin' en juneseyin' en singin' en dancin', en 8 er 10 couples got married, en bimeby eve'ybody 'mence ter say Mars Jeems McLean got a finer plantation en slicker lookin' niggers, en dat he 'uz makin' mo' cotton en corn dan any other gentleman in de county. En Mars Jeems' own junesey, Miss Libbie, heard 'bout de new gwines on Mars Jeems' plantation, en she change' her min' 'bout Mars Jeems en tuk 'im back ag'in, en 'fo' long dey had a fine weddin', en all de darkies had a big feas', and they was fiddling and dancing and funning and frolicking from sundown to morning." "And they all lived happy ever after," I said, as the old man reached a full stop. "Yes, suh," he said, interpreting my remarks as a question, "they did. Solomon used to say," he added, "dat Aun' Peggy's goopher had turnt Mars Jeems to a nigger, en dat noo hen was Mars Jeems hisse'f. But co'se Solomon didn' dast ter let on 'bout w'at he 'spicioned, en ole Aun' Peggy would 'a' 'nied it ef she had be'n axed, fer she'd 'a' got in trouble sho' ef it 'uz knowed she'd be'n cunjurin' de w'ite folks. Dis yer tale goes ter show," concluded Julius sententiously, as the man came up and announced that the spring was ready for us to get water, "dat w'ite folks w'at is so hard en stric' en don't make no 'lowance fer po' ign'ant niggers w'at ain' had no chance ter l'arn, is liable ter hab bad dreams, ter say de leas', en dat dem w'at is kin' en good ter po' people is sho' ter prosper en git 'long in de worl'." "That is a very strange story, Uncle Julius," observed my wife, smiling, "and Solomon's explanation is quite improbable." "Yes, Julius," said I, "that was powerful goopher. I am glad, too, that you told us the moral of the story. It might have escaped us otherwise. By the way, did you make that up all by yourself?" The old man's face assumed an injured look, expressive more of sorrow than of anger, and shaking his head, he replied, "No, suh, I heared dat tale befo' you er Miss Annie dere wuz bawn, suh. My mammy tol' me dat tale w'en I wa'n't mo' d'n knee high ter a hoppergrass." I drove to town next morning on some business, and did not return until noon, and after dinner I had to visit a neighbor, and did not get back until supper time. I was smoking a cigar on the back piazza in the early evening, when I saw a familiar figure carrying a bucket of water to the barn. I called my wife. "My dear," I said severely, "what is that rascal doing here? I thought I discharged him yesterday for good and all." "Oh yes," she answered, "I forgot to tell you. He was hanging round the place all the morning, and looking so down in the mouth, that I told him that if he would try to do better, we would give him one more chance. He seemed so grateful and so really in earnest in his promises of amendment, that I'm sure you'll not regret taking him back." I was seriously enough annoyed to let my cigar go out. I did not share my wife's rose colored hopes in regard to Tom, but as I did not wish the servants to think there was any conflict of authority in the household, I let the boy stay. End of Mars Jeems' Nightmare. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 4 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 4 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. The Conjurer's Revenge. Sunday was sometimes a rather dull day at our place. In the morning, when the weather was pleasant, my wife and I would drive to town, a distance of about 5 miles, to attend the church of our choice. The afternoons we spent at home, for the most part occupying ourselves with the newspapers and magazines, and the contents of a fairly good library. We had a piano in the house, on which my wife played with skill and feeling. I possessed a passable baritone voice, and could accompany myself indifferently well when my wife was not by to assist me. When these resources failed us, we were apt to find it a little dull. One Sunday afternoon in early spring, the balmy spring of North Carolina, when the air is in that ideal balance between heat and cold where one wishes it could always remain, my wife and I were seated on the front piazza, she wearily but conscientiously plowing through a missionary report, while I followed the impossible career of the blonde heroine of a rudimentary novel. I had thrown the book aside in disgust, when I saw Julius coming through the yard, under the spreading elms which were already in full leaf. He wore his Sunday clothes, and advanced with a dignity of movement quite different from his week day slouch. "Have a seat, Julius," I said, pointing to an empty rocking chair. "No, thanky, boss. I'll just sit here on the top step." "Oh, no, Uncle Julius," exclaimed Annie. "Take this chair. You will find it much more comfortable." The old man grinned in appreciation of her solicitude, and seated himself somewhat awkwardly. "Julius," I remarked, "I am thinking of setting out scuppernong vines on that sandhill where the 3 persimmon trees are. And while I'm working there, I think I'll plant watermelons between the vines, and get a little something to pay for my first year's work. The new railroad will be finished by the middle of summer, and I can ship the melons North, and get a good price for them." "If you're going to have any mo' plowing to do," replied Julius, "I 'spect you'll have to buy another creetur, 'cause it's much as dem hosses can do to 'tend to the work dey got now." "Yes, I had thought of that. I think I'll get a mule. A mule can do more work, and doesn't require as much attention as a horse." "I wouldn' 'vise you to buy no mule," remarked Julius, with a shake of his head. "Why not?" "Well, you may 'low it's all foolishness, but if I was in yo' place I wouldn' buy no mule." "But that isn't a reason. What objection have you to a mule?" "Fac' is," continued the old man in a serious tone, "I don't lack ter drive a mule. I's alluz feared I mought be imposin' on some human creetur. Eve'y time I cuts a mule wid a hick'ry, 'pears ter me mos' lackly I's cuttin' some er my own relations, er somebody else w'at can't he'p deirselves." "What put such an absurd idea into your head?" I asked. My question was followed by a short silence, during which Julius seemed engaged in a mental struggle. "I don' know ez it's wuth w'ile ter tell you dis," he said at length. "I don' hardly 'spec' fer you ter believe it. Does you 'member dat club footed man w'at helt de hoss fer you de yuther day, w'en you 'uz gittin' out er de rockaway down ter Mars Archie McMillan's sto'?" "Yes, I believe I do remember seeing a club footed man there." "Did you eber see a club footed nigger befo' er sence?" "No, I can't remember that I ever saw a club footed colored man," I replied after a moment's reflection. "You and Miss Annie wouldn' wanter b'lieve me ef I wuz ter 'low dat dat man wuz oncet a mule." "No," I replied, "I don't think it very likely that you could make us believe it." "Why, Uncle Julius," said Annie severely, "what ridiculous nonsense!" This reception of the old man's statement reduced him to silence, and it required some diplomacy on my part to induce him to vouchsafe an explanation. The prospect of a long, dull afternoon was not alluring, and I was glad to have the monotony of Sabbath quite relieved by a plantation legend. "When I was a young man," began Julius, when I had finally prevailed upon him to tell us the story, "dat club footed nigger, his name is Primus, useter belong to ole Mars Jim McGee, ober on de Lumberton Plank Road. I useter go ober dere ter see a 'oman w'at libbed on de plantation. Dat's how I come ter know all erbout it. Dis yer Primus wuz de liveliest han' on de place, alluz a dancin' en drinkin' en runnin' roun' en singin' en pickin' de banjo. 'Cep'n once in a w'ile, w'en he'd 'low he wa'n't treated right 'bout somethin' er nudder, he'd git so sulky en stubborn dat de w'ite folks couldn' hardly do nuffin wid 'im. It wuz 'gin de rules fer any er de hands ter go 'way fum de plantation at night, but Primus didn' min' de rules, en went w'en he felt lack it, en de w'ite folks p'ten' lack dey didn' know it, fer Primus wuz dangerous w'en he got in dem stubborn spells, en dey'd ruther not fool wid 'im. One night, in de spring er de year, Primus slip' off fum de plantation en went down on de Wim'l'ton Road to a dance gun by some er de free niggers down dere. Dey wuz a fiddle en a banjo en a jug gwine roun' on de outside, en Primus sung en danced till long 'bout 2 o'clock in de mawnin', when he start for home. As he come along back, he took a nigh cut 'cross the cotton fields and 'long by the edge of the mineral spring swamp, so as to get shut of the patter rollers what rid up and down the big road fer to keep the darkies from running round nights. Primus was sauntering along studyin' 'bout the good time he'd had wid the gals, when as he was gone by a fence cornder, what should he hear but somethin' grunt. He stopped a minute to listen, and he heard somethin' grunt ag'in. Den he went over to the fence whar he heard the fuss, and dere layin' in the fence cornder, on a pile of pine straw, he seed a fine, fat shote. Primus looked hard at the shote, and den started home. But somehow or udder he couldn't get away from dat shote. When he took one step forwards with one foot, the other foot 'peared to take 2 steps back'ards, and so he kept natchally getting closeter and closeter to the shote. It was de beatin'est thing. The shote des 'peared to charm Primus, and fust thing you know, Primus found hisse'f way up de road wid de shote on his back. If Primus had a knowed whose shote dat was, he'd 'a' managed to get past it somehow or 'nother. As it happened, de shote belonged to a cunjuh man w'at libbed down in de free nigger settlement. Co'se, de cunjuh man didn' hab ter wuk his roots but a little while 'fo' he foun' out who tuk his shote, en den de trouble begun. One mawnin', a day er so later, en befo' he got de shote eat up, Primus didn't go ter wuk w'en de horn blow, en w'en de oberseer went ter look fer 'im, dey wa'n't no trace er Primus ter be 'skivered nowhere. W'en he didn't come back in a day er so mo', eve'ybody on de plantation 'lowed he'd run away. His marster advertise' 'im in de papers, en offered a big reward fer 'im. De nigger ketchers fotch out de dogs en track 'im down ter de edge er de swamp, en den de scent gun out, en dat wuz de las' anybody seed of Primus fer a long, long time. 2 or 3 weeks atter Primus disappear', his marster went ter town one Sunday. Mars Jim was standin' in front er Sandy Campbell's bar room up by de ole waggin yard, w'en a po' w'ite man fum down on de Wim'l'ton Road come up to 'im en ax' 'im kinder keerless lack ef he didn' wanter buy a mule. "I don' know," says Mars Jim, "it 'pen's on de mule, en on de price. Whar is de mule?" "Des roun' here, back er ole Tom McAllister's sto'," says de po' w'ite man. "I reckon I'll hab a look at de mule," says Mars Jim, "en ef it suit me, I don' know but w'at I mought buy 'im." So de po' w'ite man tuk Mars Jim roun' back er de sto', en dere stood a monst'us fine mule. W'en de mule see Mars Jim, he gun a whinny, des lack he knowed 'im befo'. Mars Jim look at de mule, en de mule 'peared to be soun' en strong. Mars Jim 'lowed dey 'peared to be somethin' familious 'bout de mule's face, 'speshly his eyes, but he hadn' los' na'er mule, en didn' hab no recommemb'ance er havin' seen de mule befo'. He ax' de po' buckra whar he got de mule, en de po' buckra say his bruh raise de mule down on Rockfish Creek. Mars Jim wuz a little suspicious er seein' a po' w'ite man wid sech a fine creetur, but he finally 'greed ter give de man $50 fer de mule, 'bout half w'at a good mule wuz wuff dem days. He tied de mule behin' de buggy w'en he went home, en put 'im ter plowin' cotton de nex' day. De mule done mighty well fer 3 or 4 days, en den de niggers 'mence' ter notice some quare things erbout him. Dey wuz a meadow on de plantation whar dey useter put de hosses en mules ter pasture. Hit wuz fence' off fum de cornfiel on one side, but on de udder side er de pasture wuz a terbacker patch w'at wa'n't fenced off, 'ca'se de beasteses done none of 'em eat terbacky. Dey don't know w'at's good. Terbacker is lack religion. De good Lawd made it fer people, en dey ain' no udder creetur w'at kin 'preciate it. De darkies notice' dat de fus' thing de new mule done, w'en he wuz tu'ned inter de pasture, wuz ter make fer de terbacker patch. Co'se dey didn' think nuffin on it, but nex' mawnin', w'en dey went ter ketch 'im, dey 'skivered dat he'd eat up 2 whole rows er terbacker plants. Atter dat dey had ter put a halt on 'im, en tie 'im ter a stake, er e'se dey wouldn't 'a' be'n na'er a leaf er terbacker lef in de patch. Anudder day, one er de hands, name' Dolphus, hitched a mule up en drive up here ter de vimya'd. Dat wuz w'en ole Mars Dugal' owned dis place. Mars Dugal' had kilt a yearlin', en de neighbor w'ite folks all sont over fer ter git some fresh meat, and Mars Jim had sont Dolphus for some too. There was a wine press in the yard where Dolphus left a mule standing, and right in front of the press there was a tub of grape juice, just pressed out, and a little to one side a barrel about half full of wine what had been standing 2 or 3 days, and had begun to get sort of sharp to the taste. There was a couple of boards on top of this here barrel with a rock laid on 'em to hold 'em down. As I was saying, Dolphus left the mule standing in the yard and went into the smokehouse for to get the beef. By when he come out, he seed the mule a staggering about the yard, and 'fore Dolphus could get there to find out what was the matter, the mule fell right over on his side and laid there just like he was dead. All the niggers 'bout the house run out there for to see what was the matter. Some say the mule had the colic, some say one thing and some another, till by one of the hands seed the top was off of the barrel and run and looked in. 'Fo' de Lord,' he say, 'dat mule drunk, he been drinkin' de wine.' And sho' 'nuff de mule had passed right by the tub of fresh grape juice and pushed the cover off'n the barrel, and drunk 2 or 3 gallon of de wine what had been standing long enough fer to begin to get sharp. De darkies all made a great 'miration 'bout de mule gittin' drunk. Dey neber hadn't seen nuffin like it in dey bawn days. Dey poured water ober de mule en tried to sober him up, but it wa'n't no use, en Dolphus had to take de beef home on his back, en leave de mule dere till he slep' off his spree. I don't 'member whe'r I tole you er not, but when Primus disappear' fum de plantation, he lef' a wife behin' 'im, a monst'us good lookin' yeller gal name' Sally. When Primus had be'n gone a mont' er so, Sally 'mence' fer to git lonesome, en tuk up wid anudder young man name' Dan, w'at belong on de same plantation. One day dis yer Dan tuk de new mule out'n de cotton fiel' fer to plow, en w'en dey was gone 'long de turn row, who should he meet but dis yer Sally. Dan look' roun' en he didn' see de oberseer nowhar, so he stop a minute fer to run on wid Sally. "'Howdy, honey,' sezee. 'How you feelin' dis mawnin?' "'Fus' rate,' 'spon' Sally. Dey was lookin' at one anudder, en dey didn' na'er one of 'em pay no attention ter de mule, who had tu'nt his head roun' en was lookin' at Sally ez hard ez he could, en stretchin' his neck en raisin' his years, en whinin' kinder sof' to hisse'f. "'Yas, honey,' 'lows Dan, 'en you gwine ter feel fus' rate long ez you sticks ter me, fer I's a better man dan dat low down runaway nigger Primus dat you be'n wastin' yo' time wid.' Dan had let go de plow hander, en had put his arm roun' Sally, en was des gwine ter kiss her, w'en sump'n ketch 'im by de scruff er de neck en flung 'im way ober in de cotton patch. W'en he pick' hisse'f up, Sally had gone kittin' down de turn row, en de mule was standin' dere lookin' ez ca'm en peaceful ez a sunny mawnin'. Fus' Dan had 'lowed it was de oberseer w'at had kotch 'im wastin' his time, but dey wa'n't no oberseer in sight, so he 'cluded it must 'a' be'n de mule. So he pitched into de mule en lammed 'im ez hard ez he could. De mule tuk it all, en 'peared to be ez humble ez a mule could be. But w'en dey was makin' de turn at de end er de row, one er de plow lines got under de mule's hind leg. Dan retched down to git de line out, sorter careless like, w'en de mule haul off en kick 'im clean ober de fence into a brier patch on de udder side. Dan was mighty so' fum his wounds en scratches, en was laid up fer 2 or 3 days. One night de new mule got out'n de pastur' en went down to de quarters. Dan was layin' dere on his pallet, w'en he heard sump'n bangin' away at de side er his cabin. He raise' up on one shoulder en look' roun', w'en w'at should he see but de new mule's head stickin' in de winder, wid his lips drawed back over his toofs, grinnin' en snappin' at Dan des like he wanter eat 'im up. Den de mule went roun' ter de do' en kicked away like he wanter break de do' down, till by somebody come 'long en drive 'im back ter de pastur'. W'en Sally come in a little later fum de big house, where she'd be'n waitin' on de w'ite folks, she foun' po' Dan nigh 'bout dead, he was so skeered. She 'lowed Dan had had de nightmare, but w'en dey look' at de do', dey seed de marks er de mule's huffs, so dey couldn't be no mistake 'bout w'at had happen'. Co'se de niggers tole dey marster 'bout de mule's gwines on. Fus' he didn' pay no 'tention to it, but atter a while he tole 'em ef dey didn't stop dey foolishness, he gwine tie some of 'em up. So atter dat dey didn't say nuffin mo' ter dey marster, but dey kep' on noticin' the mule's queer ways des de same. 'Long 'bout de middle er de summer, dey wuz a big camp meetin' broke out down on de Wim'l'ton Road, en nigh 'bout all de po' w'ite folks en free niggers in de settlement got 'ligion. En lo en behold, 'mongst 'em wuz de cunjuh man w'at owned de shote w'at charm Primus. Dis cunjuh man wuz a Guinea nigger, en befo' he wuz sot free had useter belong to a gentleman down in Sampson County. De cunjuh man say his daddy wuz a king, a gov'ner, er some sort er whatchamacallum, way ober yonder in Africa, where de niggers come fum, befo' he wuz stowed away en sol' ter de speculators. De cunjuh man had helped his marster out in some trouble er nudder wid his goopher, en his marster had sot 'im free en bought him a trac' er lan' down on de Wim'l'ton Road. He purten' ter be a cow doctor, but eve'ybody knowed w'at he r'ally wuz. De cunjuh man hadn' mo'd en come th'oo good befo' he wuz took sick wid a cole w'at he cotch kneelin' on de groun' so long at de mo'ners bench. Hit kep' gittin' wusser en wusser, en bimeby de rheumatiz tuk holt of 'im en drawed 'em all up, till one day he sont word up ter Mars Jim McGee's plantation, en ax' Pete, de nigger w'at tuk keer er de mules, fer ter come down dere dat night en fetch dat mule w'at his marster had bought fum de po' w'ite man durin' de summer. Pete didn' know w'at de cunjuh man wuz dribin' at, but he didn' dast ter stay away, en so dat night, w'en he done eat his bacon en his hoe cake, en drunk his molasses en water, he put a bridle on de mule en rid 'im down ter de cunjuh man's cabin. W'en he got ter de do', he lit en hitch de mule, en den knocks at de do'. He felt mighty jubous 'bout gwine in, but he wuz obleeged ter do it. He knowed he couldn't he'p hisse'f. "Pull de string," says a weak voice, en w'en Pete lif' de latch en went in, de cunjuh man wuz layin' on de bed, lookin' pale en weak, like he didn' have much longer fer ter lib. "Is you fotch de mule?" says he. Pete say yes, en de cunjuh man kep' on. "Brer Pete," says he, "I's be'n a monst'us sinner man, en I's done a power er wickedness in doin' er my days, but de good Lawd has wash' my sins away, en I feels now dat I's boun' fer de kingdom. En I feels, too, dat I ain' gwine git up fum dis bed no mo' in dis worl', en I wants ter undo some er de harm I done. En dat's de reason, Brer Pete, I sont fer you ter fetch dat mule down here. You 'member dat shote I was up to yo' plantation 'quirin' 'bout las' June?" "Yas," says Brer Pete, "I 'member yo' axin' 'bout a shote you had los'." "I don' know whetter you eber l'arnt it er no," says de cunjuh man, "but I done knowed yo' marster's Primus had tuk de shote, en I wuz boun' ter git even wid 'im. So one night I cotch 'im down by de swamp on his way ter a candy pullin', en I throwed a goopher mixture on 'im en tu'n 'im to a mule, en got a po' w'ite man ter sell de mule en we divided de money. But I don't wanter die till I turn Brer Primus back ag'in." Den de cunjuh man ax' Pete ter take down one er two gourds off'n de shelf in de corner en one er two bottles wid some kinder mixtry in 'em, en set 'em on a stool by de bed, en den he ax' 'im ter fetch de mule in. W'en de mule come in de do', he gin a snort, en sta'ted fer de bed, des like he wuz gwine jump on it. "Hol' on dere, Brer Primus," de cunjuh man hollered. "I's monst'us weak, en ef you commence on me, you won't never have no chance fer ter git turned back no mo'." De mule seed de sense er dat, en stood still. Den de cunjuh man tuk de gourds en bottles en 'mence' ter wuk de roots en yerbs, en de mule 'mence' ter turn back ter a man. Fust his years, den de res' er his head, den his shoulders en arms. All de time de cunjuh man kep' on wukkin' his roots, en Pete en Primus could see he wuz gittin' weaker en weaker all de time. "Brer Pete," says he bimeby, "gimme a drink er dem bitters out'n dat green bottle on de shelf yonder. I's gwine fas', en it'll gimme strengt fer ter finish dis wuk." Brer Pete look up on de mantelpiece, en he see de bottle in de corner. It wuz so dark in de cabin he couldn't tell whar it wuz a green bottle er no. but he hilt the bottle to the cunjuh man's mouth, and he took a big mouthful. He hadn't mo' d'n swallowed it 'fo' he 'mence' ter holler. "'You gimme de wrong bottle, Brer Pete. Dis yer bottle's got pizen in it, en I's done fer dis time, sho'. Hol' me up, fer de Lawd's sake, 'tel I git th'oo turnin' Brer Primus back.' So Pete hilt 'im up, en he kep' on wukkin' de roots, 'tel he got de goopher all tuk off'n Brer Primus 'ceptin' one foot. He hadn't got dis foot mo' d'n half turnt back befo' his strenk gun out enti'ely, en he drapped de roots en fell back on de bed. "'I can't do no mo' fer you, Brer Primus,' says he, 'but I hopes you will fergive me fer w'at harm I done you. I knows de good Lawd done fergive me, en I hope ter meet you bofe in glory. I sees de good angels waitin' fer me up yonder wid a long white robe en a starry crown, en I'm on my way ter join 'em.' En so de cunjuh man died, en Pete en Primus went back to de plantation. De darkies all made a great 'miration w'en Primus come back. Mars Jim let on lack he didn't b'lieve de tale de two niggers tole. He says Primus had run away, en stayed 'tel he got tired er de swamps, en den come back on 'em ter be fed. He tried ter 'count fer de shape er Primus's foot by sayin' Primus got his foot smash', er snake bit, er sump'n, w'iles he wuz away, en den stayed out in de woods whar he couldn't git it kyo'd up straight, 'stid er comin' 'long home whar a doctor could 'a' 'tended ter it. But de niggers all notice' de marster didn't tie Primus up, ner take on much 'ca'se de mule wuz gone. So dey 'lowed dey marster must 'a' had his s'picions 'bout dat cunjuh man." My wife had listened to Julius's recital with only a mild interest. When the old man had finished it, she remarked, "That story does not appeal to me, Uncle Julius, and is not up to your usual mark. It isn't pathetic, it has no moral that I can discover, and I can't see why you should tell it. In fact, it seems to me like nonsense." The old man looked puzzled as well as pained. He had not pleased the lady, and he did not seem to understand why. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said reproachfully, "ef you don't like dat tale. I can't make out w'at you means by some er dem words you uses, but I'm tellin' nuffin but de trufe. Co'se I didn't see de cunjuh man turn 'im back, fer I wa'n't dere, but I be'n hearin' de tale fer 25 years, en I ain' got no 'casion fer ter 'spute it. Dey's so many things a body knows is lies, dat dey ain' no use gwine roun' findin' fault wid tales dat mought des ez well be so ez not. Fer instance, dey's a young nigger gone ter school in town, en he come out here de yuther day en 'lowed dat de sun stood still en de earth turnt roun' eve'y day on a kinder axle–tree. I tole dat young nigger ef he didn't take hisse'f away wid dem lies, I'd take a buggy trace ter 'im. Fer I sees de earth standin' still all de time, en I sees de sun gwine aroun' it, en ef a man can't b'lieve w'at he sees, I can't see no use in livin'. Might's well die en be whar we can't see nuffin. En another thing w'at proves de tale 'bout dis ole Primus is de way he goes on ef anybody ax 'im how he come by dat club foot. I axed 'im one day, mighty perlite en civil, en he call' me a ole fool en got so mad he ain' spoke ter me sence. It's monst'us queer. But dis is a queer world, any way you could fix it," concluded the old man with a weary sigh. "If you makes up yo' min' not ter buy dat mule, suh," he added as he rose to go, "I knows a man w'at's got a good hoss he wants ter sell. Leas'ways dat's w'at I heared. I'm gwine ter prayer meetin' ter night, en I'm gwine right by de man's house, en ef you'd like ter take a look at de hoss, I'll ax 'im ter fetch 'im roun'." "Oh, yes," I said, "you can ask him to stop in if he is passing. There will be no harm in looking at the horse, though I rather think I shall buy a mule." Early next morning the man brought the horse up to the vineyard. At that time I was not a very good judge of horse flesh. The horse appeared sound and gentle, and, as the owner assured me, had no bad habits. The man wanted a large price for the horse, but finally agreed to accept a much smaller sum, upon payment of which I became possessed of a very fine looking animal. But alas for the deceitfulness of appearances! I soon ascertained that the horse was blind in one eye, and that the sight of the other was very defective, and not a month elapsed before my purchase developed most of the diseases that horseflesh is heir to, and a more worthless, broken-winded, spavined quadruped never disgraced the noble name of horse. After worrying through 2 or 3 months of life, he expired one night in a fit of the colic. I replaced him with a mule, and Julius henceforth had to take his chances of driving some metamorphosed unfortunate. Circumstances that afterwards came to my knowledge created in my mind a strong suspicion that Julius may have played a more than unconscious part in this transaction. Among other significant facts was his appearance, the Sunday following the purchase of the horse, in a new suit of store clothes, which I had seen displayed in the window of Mr. Solomon Cohen's store on my last visit to town, and had remarked on account of their striking originality of cut and pattern. As I had not recently paid Julius any money, and as he had no property to mortgage, I was driven to conjecture to account for his possession of the means to buy the clothes. Of course I would not charge him with duplicity unless I could prove it, at least to a moral certainty, but for a long time afterwards I took his advice only in small doses and with great discrimination. End of The Conjurer's Revenge. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 5 of The Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 5 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Sis Becky's Pickaninny. We had not lived in North Carolina very long before I was able to note a marked improvement in my wife's health. The ozone-laden air of the surrounding piney woods, the mild and equable climate, the peaceful leisure of country life, had brought about in hopeful measure the cure we had anticipated. Toward the end of our second year, however, her ailment took an unexpected turn for the worse. She became the victim of a settled melancholy, attended with vague forebodings of impending misfortune. "You must keep up her spirits," said our physician, the best in the neighboring town. "This melancholy lowers her tone too much, tends to lessen her strength, and, if it continue too long, may be fraught with grave consequences." I tried various expedients to cheer her up. I read novels to her. I had the hands on the place come up in the evening and serenade her with plantation songs. Friends came in sometimes and talked, and frequent letters from the North kept her in touch with her former home. But nothing seemed to rouse her from the depression into which she had fallen. One pleasant afternoon in spring, I placed an armchair in a shaded portion of the front piazza, and, filling it with pillows, led my wife out of the house and seated her where she would have the pleasantest view of a somewhat monotonous scenery. She was scarcely placed when old Julius came through the yard, and, taking off his tattered straw hat, inquired somewhat anxiously, "How is you feelin' dis atternoon, ma'am?" "She is not very cheerful, Julius," I said. My wife was apparently without energy enough to speak for herself. The old man did not seem inclined to go away, so I asked him to sit down. I had noticed, as he came up, that he held some small object in his hand. When he had taken his seat on the top step, he kept fingering this object. What it was I could not quite make out. "What is that you have there, Julius?" I asked with mild curiosity. "Dis is my rabbit foot, suh." This was at a time before this curious superstition had attained its present jocular popularity among white people, and, while I had heard of it before, it had not yet outgrown the charm of novelty. "What do you do with it?" "I kyars it wid me fer luck, suh." "Julius," I observed half to him and half to my wife, Your people will never rise in the world until they throw off these childish superstitions and learn to live by the light of reason and common sense. How absurd to imagine that the 4 foot of a poor dead rabbit, with which he timorously felt his way along through a life surrounded by snares and pitfalls, beset by enemies on every hand, can promote happiness or success, or ward off failure or misfortune. "It is ridiculous," assented my wife, with faint interest. "Dat's what I tells dese niggers roun' here," said Julius. "De foot ain't got no power. It has to be de hind foot, suh. De lef hind foot er a grabeyard rabbit kilt by a cross-eyed nigger on a dark night in de full of de moon." "They must be very rare and valuable," I said. "Dey is kinder scarce, suh, en dey ain' no 'mount er money could buy mine, suh. I might len' it ter anybody I saw stop by, but I wouldn' sell it. No, indeed, suh, I wouldn'." "How do you know it brings good luck?" I asked. "'Ca'se I ain' had no bad luck sence I had it, suh, en I's had dis rabbit foot fer 40 years. I had a good marster befo' de wah, en I wasn't sol' away, en I was sot free, en dat is all good luck." "But that doesn't prove anything," I rejoined. "Many other people have gone through a similar experience, and probably more than one of them had no rabbit's foot." "Law, suh, you doan hafter prove 'bout de rabbit foot. Eve'ybody knows dat. Leas'ways, eve'ybody roun' here knows it. But ef it has ter be proved ter folks w'at wa'n't born en raise' in dis neighborhood, dey is a easy way ter prove it. Is I eber tole you de tale er Sis' Becky en a pickaninny?" "No," I said. "Let us hear it." I thought perhaps the story might interest my wife as much or more than the novel I had meant to read from. "Dis yer Becky," Julius began, "use' ter belong ter ole Kunnel Pen'leton, who owned a plantation down on de Wim'l'ton Road, 'bout 10 miles from here, des befo' you gits ter Black Swamp. Dis yer Becky wuz a fiel' han', en a monst'us good 'un. She had a husban' oncet, a nigger w'at belonged ter de nex' plantation. But de man w'at owned her husban' died, en his lan' en his niggers had ter be sole fer ter pay his debts. Kunnel Pen'leton 'lowed he'd 'a' bought dis nigger, but he had be'n bettin' on hoss races, en didn' have no money, en so Becky's husban' wuz sole away ter Ferginny. Co'se Becky went on some 'bout losin' her man, but she couldn't he'p herse'f, en 'sides dat, she had a pickaninny fer ter comfo't her. Dis yer little Mose wuz de cutetes', blackes', shiny eyedest little nigger you eber laid eyes on, en he wuz ez fon' er his mammy ez his mammy wuz er him. Co'se Becky had ter wuk, en didn' have much time ter was'e wid her baby. Ole Aun' Nancy, de plantation nuss down at de quarters, use' ter take keer er little Mose in de daytime, en atter de niggers come in fum de cotton fiel', Becky 'ud git her chile en kiss 'im en nuss 'im en keep 'im 'tel mawnin', en on Sundays she'd have 'im in de cabin wid her all day long. Sis' Becky had got sorter use' ter gittin' 'long widout her husban', w'en one day Kunnel Pen'leton went ter de races. Co'se w'en he went ter de races he tuk his hosses, en co'se he bet on his own hosses, en co'se he los' his money, fer Kunnel Pen'leton didn' neber have no luck wid his hosses, ef he did keep hisse'f po' projeckin' wid 'em. But dis time dere wuz a hoss name' Lightnin' Bug, w'at belonged ter anudder man, en dis hoss won de sweepstakes, en Kunnel Pen'leton tuk a likin' ter dat hoss, en ax' his owner w'at he wuz willin' ter take fer 'im. 'I'll take $1,000 fer dat hoss,' sez dis yer man, who had a big plantation down to'ds Wim'l'ton, whar he raise' hosses fer ter race en ter sell. Well, Kunnel Pen'leton scratch his head, en wonder whar he wuz gwine ter raise $1,000, en he didn' see des how he could do it, fer he owed ez much ez he could borrow already on de skeoutity he could gib. But he wuz des boun' ter hab dat hoss, so sez he, 'I'll gib you my note fer $1,100 fer dat hoss.' De yuther man shuck his head en sezee, 'Yo' note, suh, is better'n gold, I don't doubt, but I's made it a rule in my business not ter take no notes fum nobody. Howsomeber, suh, ef you is kinder short er funds, mos' likely we kin make some kinder bargain. and w'iles we is talkin', I might's well say dat I needs another good nigger down on my place. Ef you is got a good one to spare, I might trade wid you.' Now, Colonel Pen'leton didn't really have no niggers fer to spare, but he 'lowed to hisse'f he was jes' bleedzd to hab dat hoss, en so he sez he, 'Well, I doan lack ter, but I reckon I'll hafter. You come out ter my plantation termorrer en look ober my niggers, en pick out de one you wants.' So, sho' 'nuff, nex' day dis yer man come out ter Colonel Pen'leton's place, en rid roun' de plantation en glanced at de niggers, en who should he pick out fum 'em all but Sis' Becky. 'I needs a new nigger woman down ter my place,' sezee, 'fer ter cook en wash en so on, en dat young woman 'll jes' fill de bill. You gimme her, en you kin hab Lightnin' Bug.' Now, Colonel Pen'leton didn't lack ter trade Sis' Becky, 'cause she was nigh 'bout de best fiel' han' he had. En 'sides, Mars Colonel didn't keer ter take de mammies 'way fum dey child'n w'iles dey child'n was little. But dis man say he want Becky, er else Colonel Pen'leton couldn't have de race hoss. 'Well,' says de Colonel, 'you kin hab de woman, but I doan lack ter sen' her away fum her baby. W'at'll you gimme fer dat nigger baby?' 'I don't want de baby,' says de other man. 'I ain' got no use fer dat baby.' 'I'll tell you w'at I'll do,' 'lows Colonel Pen'leton. 'I'll th'ow dat pickaninny in fer good measure.' But de other man shook his head. 'No,' says he, 'I's much obleeged, but I don't raise niggers. I raise hosses, en I don't wanter be botherin' wid no nigger babies. Nemmine de baby. I'll keep dat woman so busy she'll fergit de baby, fer niggers is made ter wuk, en dey ain' got no time fer no such foolishness ez babies.' Colonel Pen'leton didn't want to hurt Becky's feelin's, fer Colonel Pen'leton was a kin' hearted man, en neber lacked ter make no trouble fer nobody, en so he tole Becky he was gwine ter sen' her down to Robeson County fer a day er so to he'p out his son in law in his wuk, en bein' ez dis other man was gwine dat way, he had axed him to take her along in his buggy. 'Can I carry little Mose wid me, massa?' ax' Sis' Becky. 'No,' says de Colonel, as if he was studyin' whether to let her take him or no. 'I reckon you better let Aun' Nancy look after yo' baby fer de day er two you'll be gone, en she'll see dat he gits enough ter eat till you gits back.' So Sis' Becky hug en kiss little Mose, en tole 'im ter be a good little pickaninny en take keer er hisse'f, en not fergit his mammy w'iles she was gone. En little Mose put his arms aroun' his mammy en laughed en crowed des like it was monst'us fine fun fer his mammy ter go away en leabe 'im. Well, dis yer hoss trader sta'ted out wid Becky, en bimeby, atter dey'd gone down de Lumberton road fer a few miles er so, dis man turnt roun' in a diff'ent direction, en kep' goin' dat a way, till bimeby Sis' Becky up en ax' 'im ef he was gwine ter Robeson County by new road. 'Nah, nigger,' says he, 'I ain' gwine ter Robeson County at all. I's gwine ter Bladen County, whar my plantation is, en whar I raises all my hosses.' 'But how is I gwine ter git ter Miss Laura's plantation down in Robeson County?' says Becky, wid her heart in her mouf, fer she commenced ter git skeered all er suddin. 'You ain' gwine ter git dere at all,' says de man. 'You belongs ter me now, fer I done traded my best race hoss fer you, wid yo' ole marster. Ef you's a good gal, I'll treat you right, en ef you don't behabe yo'se'f, w'y, w'at else happens 'll be yo' own fault.' Co'se Sis' Becky cried en went on about her pickaninny, but co'se it didn't do no good, en bimeby dey got down ter dis yer man's place, en he put Sis' Becky ter wuk, en fergot all about her havin' a pickaninny. Meanwhiles, w'en evenin' come, de day Sis' Becky was took away, little Mose commenced ter git restless, en bimeby, w'en his mammy didn't come, he sta'ted ter cry fer her. Aun' Nancy fed him en rocked him, en finally he des cried en cried till he cried hisse'f ter sleep. De nex' day he didn't 'pear ter be ez peart ez usual, en w'en night come he fretted en went on wuss'n he did de night befo'. De nex' day his little eyes commenced ter lose dey shine, en he wouldn't eat nuffin, en he commenced ter look so peaked dat Aun' Nancy tuk en kyar'd 'im up ter de big house en showed 'im ter her ole missus, en her ole missus gun her some medicine fer 'im, en 'lowed ef he didn't git no better she should fetch 'im up ter de big house ag'in, en dey'd hab a doctor,
en nuss little Mose up dere, fer Aunt Nancy's ole missus 'lowed he was a lackly little nigger en wuth raisin'. But Aunt Nancy had learnt to like little Mose, en she didn't want to have 'im took up to the big house. En so w'en he didn't git no better, she gathered a mess er green peas en tuck de peas en de baby en went to see ole Aunt Peggy, de Conjure Woman down by de Wim'l'ton Road. She gun Aunt Peggy de mess er peas en tole her about Sis' Becky en little Mose. "Dat is a monst'us small mess er peas you is fotch me," says Aunt Peggy, says she. "Yes, I knows," 'lowed Aunt Nancy, "but dis yer is a monst'us small pickaninny." "You'll have to fetch me somethin' mo'," says Aunt Peggy, "fer you can't 'spec' me to waste my time diggin' roots en wukkin' conju'ation fer nuffin." "All right," says Aunt Nancy, "I'll fetch you somethin' mo' nex' time." "You better," says Aunt Peggy, "er else dere'll be trouble. W'at dis yer little pickaninny needs is ter see his mammy. You leave 'im here dis ebenin', en I'll show 'im his mammy." So w'en Aunt Nancy had gone away, Aunt Peggy tuck en wuked her roots, en turnt little Mose to a hummin' bird, en sont 'im off fer ter fin' his mammy. So little Mose flewed en flewed en flewed away, 'tel bimeby he got ter de place whar Sis' Becky b'longed. He seed his mammy wukkin' roun' de yard, en he could tell fum lookin' at her dat she was troubled in her min' 'bout sump'n, en feelin' kinder po'ly. Sis' Becky heared sump'n hummin' roun' en roun' her, sweet en low. Fus' she 'lowed it wuz a hummin' bird, den she thought it sounded lack her little Mose, croonin' on her breas', way back yonner on de ole plantation. En she jes' imagined it wuz her little Mose, en it made her feel better, en she went on 'bout her wuk pearter 'n she'd done sence she'd be'n down dere. Little Mose stayed roun' 'tel late in de ebenin', en den flewed back ez hard ez he could ter Aunt Peggy. Ez fer Sis' Becky, she drempt all dat night dat she wuz holdin' her pickaninny in her arms, en kissin' 'im en nussin' 'im, des lack she useter do back on de ole plantation whar he wuz born. En fer 3 er 4 days Sis' Becky went 'bout her wuk wid mo' sperrit dan she'd showed sence she'd be'n down dere ter dis man's plantation. De nex' day atter he come back, little Mose wuz mo' pearter en better'n he had be'n fer a long time. But to'ds de een' er de week he 'mence' ter git res'less ag'in, en stop eatin', en Aunt Nancy kyar'd 'im down ter Aunt Peggy once mo', en she turnt 'im to a mockin' bird dis time, en sont 'im off ter see his mammy ag'in. It didn' take 'im long fer ter git dere, en w'en he did, he seed his mammy standin' in de kitchen lookin' back in de direction little Mose wuz comin' fum, en dey wuz tears in her eyes, en she looked mo' po'ly en peaked 'n she had w'en he wuz down dere befo'. So little Mose sot on a tree in de yard en sung en sung en sung, des fittin' ter split his throat. Fus' Sis' Becky didn' notice 'im much, but dis mockin' bird kep' stayin' roun' de house all day, en bimeby Sis' Becky des 'magined dat mockin' bird wuz her little Mose, crowin' en crowin', des lack he useter do w'en his mammy would come home at night fum de cotton fiel'. De mockin' bird stayed roun' dere mos' all day, en w'en Sis' Becky went out in de yard one time, dis yer mockin' bird lit on her shoulder en peck at de piece er bread she wuz eatin', en fluttered his wings so dey rub up agin de side er her head. En w'en he flewed away 'long late in de ebenin', des 'fo' sundown, Sis' Becky felt mo' better'n she had sence she had heared dat hummin' bird a week er so pas', en dat night she dremp 'bout ole times ag'in, des lack she did befo'. But dis yer totin' little Mose down ter ole Aunt Peggy, en dis yer gittin' things fer ter pay de Conjure Woman use up a lot er Aunt Nancy's time, en she begun ter git kinder tired. 'Sides dat, w'en Sis' Becky had be'n on de plantation, she had useter help Aunt Nancy wid de young'uns ebenin's en Sundays. En Aunt Nancy commenced ter miss her monst'us, 'specially sence she got a tech er de rheumatiz herse'f, en so she 'lows ter ole Aunt Peggy one day, "Aunt Peggy, ain't dey no way you kin fetch Sis' Becky back home?" "Huh!" says Aunt Peggy, "I don' know 'bout dat. I'll hafter wuk my roots en fin' out whether I can er no, but it'll take a monst'us heap er wuk, en I can't waste my time fer nuffin. Ef you'll fetch me sump'n ter pay me fer my trouble, I reckon we kin fix it." So nex' day Aunt Nancy went down ter see Aunt Peggy ag'in. "Aunt Peggy," says she, "I has fotch you my bes' Sunday head hankercher. Will dat do?" Aunt Peggy look at de head handkercher, en run her hand ober it, en says she, 'Yes, dat'll do fus' rate. I's be'n workin' my roots sence you be'n gone, en I 'lows mos' lackly I kin git Sis Becky back, but it's gwine take figgerin' en studyin' ez well ez cunjurin'. De fus' thing ter do'll be ter stop fetchin' dat pickaninny down here, en not sen' 'im ter see his mammy no mo'. Ef he gits too po'ly, you lemme know, en I'll gib you some kin' er mixtry fer ter make 'im fergit Sis Becky fer a week er so. So less'n you comes fer dat, you needn't ter come back ter see me no mo' 'tel I sends fer you.' So Aunt Peggy sont Aunt Nancy away, en de fus' thing she done wuz ter call a hornet from her nes' under her eaves. 'You go up ter Kunnel Pen'leton's stable, Hornet,' says she, 'en sting de knees er de race hoss name' Lightnin' Bug. Be sho' en git de right one.' So de hornet flewed up ter Kunnel Pen'leton's stable en stung Lightnin' Bug roun' de legs, en de nex' mawnin' Lightnin' Bug's knees wuz all swole up, twicet ez big ez dey oughter be. W'en Kunnel Pen'leton went out ter de stable en see de hoss's legs, it would 'a' des made you trimble like a leaf fer ter hear him cuss dat hoss trader. Howsomeber, he cool off bimeby, en tole de stable boy fer ter rub Lightnin' Bug's legs wid some linimum. De boy done ez his marster tole 'im, en by de nex' day de swellin' had gone down consid'able. Aunt Peggy had sont a sparrer w'at had her nes' in one er de trees close to her cabin fer ter watch w'at wuz gwine on roun' de big house, en w'en dis yer sparrer tole her de hoss wuz gittin' ober de swellin', she sont de hornet back fer ter sting his knees some mo', en de nex' mawnin' Lightnin' Bug's legs wuz swole up wuss'n dan befo'. Well, dis time Kunnel Pen'leton wuz mad thoo en thoo, en all de way roun', en he cussed dat hoss trader up en down, fum A ter Izzard. He cussed so hard dat de stable boy got mos' scared ter death, en went off en hid hisse'f in de hay. Ez fer Kunnel Pen'leton, he went right up to de house en got out his pen en ink, en tuk off his coat en roll' up his sleeves, en writ a letter ter dis yer hoss trader, en sezee, 'You is sol' me a hoss w'at is got a ring bone er a spavin er sump'n, en w'at I paid you fer wuz a soun' hoss. I want you ter sen' my nigger woman back en take yo' ole hoss, er e'se I'll sue you sho's you bawn.' But dis yer man wa'n't skeered a bit, en he writ back ter Kunnel Pen'leton dat a bargain wuz a bargain, dat Lightnin' Bug wuz soun' w'en he sol' 'im, en ef Kunnel Pen'leton didn't knowed enough about hosses ter take keer of a fine racer, dat wuz his own funeral, en dey say Kunnel Pen'leton kin sue en be cussed fer all he keer, but he ain't gwine ter give up de nigger he bought en paid fer." W'en Kunnel Pen'leton got dis letter, he wuz mad'n he wuz befo', 'specially 'cause de man 'lowed he didn't know how ter take keer of fine hosses. But he couldn't do nuffin but fetch a lawsuit, en he knowed by his own 'sperience dat lawsuits wuz slow ez a 7-year itch, en cos' mo' d'n dey come ter, en he 'lowed he better go slow en wait a w'ile. Aunt Peggy knowed w'at wuz gwine on all dis time, en she fix' up a little bag wid some roots en one thing er anudder in it, en gun it ter dis sparrer er her'n, en tole 'im ter take it way down yonder whar Sis Becky wuz, en drap it right befo' de do' er her cabin, so she'd be sho' en fin' it de fus time she come out'n de do'. One night Sis Becky dreamt her pickaninny wuz dead, en de nex' day she wuz moanin' en groanin' all day. She dreamt de same dream 3 nights runnin', en den, de nex' mawnin' atter de las' night, she foun' dis yer little bag de sparrer had drap' in front er her do', en she 'lowed she'd be'n conjured, en wuz gwine ter die, en ez long ez her pickaninny wuz dead, dey wa'n't no use tryin' ter do nuffin nohow. En so she tuk en went ter bed, en tole her marster she'd be'n conjured, en wuz gwine ter die. Her marster laughed at her, en argy'd wid her, en tried ter 'suade her out er dis yer fool notion, ez he called it, fer he wuz one er dese yer w'ite folks w'at perten' dey don't beliebe in conjurin', but it wa'n't no use. Sis Becky kep' gittin' wusser en wusser, 'tel fin'ly dis yer man 'lowed Sis Becky wuz gwine ter die sho' 'nuff, en ez he knowed dey hadn't be'n nuffin de matter wid Lightnin' Bug w'en he traded 'im, he 'lowed maybe he could kyore 'im en fetch 'im roun' all right, leas'ways good 'nuff ter sell ag'in. En anyhow, a lame hoss wuz better'n a dead nigger. So he set down en writ Kunnel Pen'leton a letter. "My conscience," says he, has been troubling me 'bout dat ring-bone hoss I sole you. Some folks 'lows a hoss trader ain' got no conscience, but dey don't know me, for dat is my weak spot, and de reason I ain' made no mo' money hoss tradin'. Fac' is,' sezee, 'I's got so I can't sleep nights from studyin' 'bout dat spavin' hoss, en I's made up my min' dat w'iles a bargain is a bargain, en you seed Lightnin' Bug befo' you traded fer 'im, principle is wuth mo' d'n money, or hosses, or niggers. So ef you'll sen' Lightnin' Bug down here, I'll sen' yo' nigger woman back, en we'll call de trade off, en be as good frien's ez we eber wuz, en no hard feelin's.' So, sho' 'nuff, Kunnel Pen'leton sont de hoss back, en w'en de man w'at come ter bring Lightnin' Bug tol' Sis' Becky her pickaninny wa'n't dead, Sis' Becky wuz so glad dat she 'lowed she wuz gwine ter try ter live 'tel she got back whar she could see little Mose once mo'. En w'en she retch de ole plantation en seed her baby kickin' en crowin' en holdin' out his little arms to'ds her, she wush she wa'n't cunjured en didn' have ter die. En w'en Aun' Nancy tol' her all erbout Aun' Peggy, Sis' Becky went down ter see de Conjure Woman, en Aun' Peggy tol' her she had cunjured her. En den Aun' Peggy tuk de goopher off'n her, en she got well, en stayed on de plantation, en raise' her pickaninny. En w'en little Mose growed up, he could sing en whistle des like a mockin' bird, so dat de w'ite folks useter hab 'im come up ter de big house at night, en whistle en sing fer 'im, en dey useter give 'im money, en vittles, en one thing er 'nother, w'ich he alluz tuk home to his mammy, fer he knowed all 'bout w'at she had gone th'oo. He turnt out ter be a smart man, en learnt de blacksmif trade, en Kunnel Pen'leton let 'im high his time. En bimeby he bought his mammy en sot her free, en den he bought hisse'f en tuk care er Sis' Becky ez long ez dey bofe libbed." My wife had listened to this story with greater interest than she had manifested in any subject for several days. I had watched her furtively from time to time during the recital, and had observed the play of her countenance. It had expressed in turn sympathy, indignation, pity, and, at the end, lively satisfaction. "That is a very ingenious fairy tale, Julius," I said, "and we are much obliged to you." "Why, John," said my wife severely, "the story bears the stamp of truth, if ever a story did." "Yes," I replied, "especially the humming bird episode and the mocking bird digression, to say nothing of the doings of the hornet and the sparrow." "Oh, well, I don't care," she rejoined, with delightful animation. "Those are mere ornamental details, and not at all essential. The story is true to nature, and might have happened half a hundred times, and no doubt did happen in those horrid days before the war." "By the way, Julius," I remarked, "your story doesn't establish what you started out to prove, that a rabbit's foot brings good luck." "It's plain 'nuff ter me, suh," replied Julius. "I bet young missis dere kin 'splain it herse'f." "I rather suspect," replied my wife promptly, "that Sis' Becky had no rabbit's foot." "You is hit de bull's eye de fus' fire, ma'am," assented Julius. "Ef Sis' Becky had had a rabbit foot, she neber would 'a' went th'ough all dis trouble." I went into the house for some purpose, and left Julius talking to my wife. When I came back a moment later he was gone. My wife's condition took a turn for the better from this very day, and she was soon on the way to ultimate recovery. Several weeks later, after she had resumed her afternoon drives, which had been interrupted by her illness, Julius brought the rockaway round to the front door one day, and I assisted my wife into the carriage. "John," she said before I had taken my seat, "I wish you would look in my room and bring me my handkerchief. You will find it in the pocket of my blue dress." I went to execute the commission. When I pulled the handkerchief out of her pocket, something else came with it and fell on the floor. I picked up the object and looked at it. It was Julius's rabbit's foot. End of Sis' Becky's Pickaninny. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 6 of the Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain.
For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 6 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. The Gray Wolf's Haunt. It was a rainy day at the vineyard. The morning had dawned bright and clear, but the sky had soon clouded, and by 9 o'clock there was a light shower, followed by others at brief intervals. By noon the rain had settled into a dull, steady downpour. The clouds hung low, and seemed to grow denser instead of lighter as they discharged their watery burden, and there was now and then a muttering of distant thunder. Outdoor work was suspended, and I spent most of the day at the house, looking over my accounts and bringing up some arrears of correspondence. Towards 4 o'clock I went out on the piazza, which was broad and dry, and less gloomy than the interior of the house, and composed myself for a quiet smoke. I had lit my cigar and opened the volume I was reading at that time, when my wife, whom I had left dozing on a lounge, came out and took a rocking chair near me. "I wish you would talk to me, or read to me, or something," she exclaimed petulantly. "It's awfully dull here to day." "I'll read to you with pleasure," I replied, and began at the point where I had found my bookmark. The difficulty of dealing with transformations so many-sided as those which all existences have undergone, or are undergoing, is such as to make a complete and deductive interpretation almost hopeless. So to grasp the total process of redistribution of matter and motion as to see simultaneously its several necessary results in their actual interdependence is scarcely possible. There is, however, a mode of rendering the process as a whole tolerably comprehensible. Though the genesis of the rearrangement of every evolving aggregate is in itself one, it presents to our intelligence— "John," interrupted my wife, "I wish you would stop reading that nonsense and see who that is coming up the lane." I closed my book with a sigh. I had never been able to interest my wife in the study of philosophy, even when presented in the simplest and most lucid form. Some one was coming up the lane, at least a huge faded cotton umbrella was making progress toward the house, and beneath it a pair of nether extremities in trousers was discernible. Any doubt in my mind as to whose they were was soon resolved when Julius reached the steps, and, putting the umbrella down, got a good dash of the rain as he stepped up on the porch. "Why in the world, Julius," I asked, "didn't you keep the umbrella up until you got under cover?" "It's bad luck, suh, to raise a umbrella in the house, and w'iles I don't know whether it's bad luck to kyar one into the piazza er no, I 'lows it's alluz best ter be on the safe side. I didn' s'pose you en young missis 'u'd be gwine on yo' dribe ter day, but bein' ez it's my pa't ter take you ef you does, I 'lowed I'd report fer duty, en let you say whether er no you wants ter go." "I'm glad you came, Julius," I responded. "We don't want to go driving, of course, in the rain, but I should like to consult you about another matter. I'm thinking of taking in a piece of new ground. What do you imagine it would cost to have that neck of woods down by the swamp cleared up?" The old man's countenance assumed an expression of unwonted seriousness, and he shook his head doubtfully. "I doan know 'bout dat, suh. It mought cos' mo', en it mought cos' less, ez fur ez money is consarned. I ain' denyin' you could cl'ar up dat trac' er lan' fer $100 er a couple er $100, ef you wants ter cl'ar it up. But ef dat 'uz my trac' er lan', I wouldn' disturb it, no suh, I wouldn'. Sho's you bawn I wouldn'." "But why not?" I asked. "It ain't fittin' fer grapes, fer new groun' nebber is." "I know it, but—" "It ain' no yearthly good fer cotton, 'cause it's too low." "Perhaps, but it will raise splendid corn." "I doan know," rejoined Julius deprecatorially. "It's so near de swamp dat de coons'll eat up all de co'n." "I think I'll risk it," I answered. "Well, suh," said Julius, "I wishes you much joy of your job. If you has bad luck, er sickness, er trouble er any kind, don't blame me. You can't say old Julius didn't warn you." "Warn him of what, Uncle Julius?" asked my wife. "Er de bad luck w'at follers folks w'at 'sturbs dat trac' of lan'. Dey is snakes en scorpions in dem woods, en ef you manages ter 'scape de p'ison animals, you is des boun' ter hab a ha'nt ter settle wid, ef you doan hab two." "Whose haunt?" my wife demanded with growing interest. "De gray wolf's ha'nt, some folks calls it, but I knows better." "Tell us about it, Uncle Julius," said my wife. "A story will be a godsend to day." It was not difficult to induce the old man to tell a story, if he were in a reminiscent mood. Of tales of the old slavery days he seemed indeed to possess an exhaustless store, some weirdly grotesque, some broadly humorous, some bearing the stamp of truth, faint perhaps, but still discernible, others palpable inventions, whether his own or not we never knew, though his fancy doubtless embellished them. But even the wildest was not without an element of pathos, the tragedy, it might be, of the story itself, the shadow, never absent, of slavery and of ignorance, the sadness always of life as seen by the fading light of an old man's memory. "Way back yonder, befo' de wah," began Julius, "ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo useter own a nigger name' Dan. Dan wuz big en strong en hearty en peaceable en good natured, most er de time, but dangerous ter aggravate. He alluz done his task, en never had no trouble wid de w'ite folks, but woe be unto a nigger w'at 'lowed he could fool wid Dan, fer he wuz mos' sho' ter git a good lammin'. Soon ez eve'ybody foun' Dan out, dey didn' many un 'em 'tempt ter 'sturb 'im. De one dat did would 'a wush' he hadn', ef he could 'a' libbed long ernuff ter do any wushin'. It all happen' dis a way. Dey wuz a cunjuh man w'at libbed ober ter de udder side er de Lumberton Road. He had be'n de only cunjuh doctor in de neighborhood fer 'long dis many years, 'tel ole Aun' Peggy sot up in de bizness down by de Wim'l'ton Road. Dis cunjuh man had a son w'at libbed wid 'im, en it wuz dis yer son w'at got mix' up wid Dan, en all 'bout a 'oman. Dey wuz a gal on de plantation name' Mahaly. She wuz a monst'us lackly gal, tall en supple, wid big eyes, en a small foot, en a lively tongue, en w'en Dan tuk ter gwine wid her, eve'ybody 'lowed dey wuz well match', en none er de other nigger men on de plantation dares ter go near her, fer dey wuz all feared er Dan. Now it happen' dat dis yer cunjuh man's son wuz gwine 'long de road one day, w'en who should come pas' but Mahaly, en de minute dis man sot eye on Mahaly, he 'lowed he wuz gwine ter hab her fer hisse'f. He come up side er her en 'mence' ter talk ter her, but she didn' pay no 'tention ter 'im, fer she wuz studyin' 'bout Dan, en she didn' lack dis nigger's looks nohow. So w'en she got ter whar she wuz gwine, dis yer man wa'n't no furder 'long dan he wuz w'en he sta'ted. Co'se, atter he had made up his min' fer ter git Mahaly, he 'mence' ter 'quire roun', en soon foun' out all 'bout Dan, en w'at a dangerous nigger he wuz. But dis man 'lowed his daddy wuz a cunjuh man, en so he come out all right in de een', en he kep' right atter Mahaly. Meanwhiles Dan's marster had said dey could git ma'd ef dey want her, en so Dan en Mahaly had tuk up wid one anudder, en wuz libbin' in a cabin by deyse'ves, en wuz des wrop' up in one anudder. But dis yer cunjuh man's son didn' 'pear ter min' Dan's takin' up wid Mahaly, en he kep' on hangin' roun' des de same, 'tel fin'ly one day Mahaly says ter Dan, sez she, 'I wish you'd do sump'n ter stop dat free nigger man fum followin' me roun'. I doan lack 'im nohow, en I ain' got no time fer ter was'e wid no man but you.' Co'se Dan got mad w'en he heard 'bout dis man pesterin' Mahaly, en de nex' night, w'en he seed dis nigger comin' 'long de road, he up en ax' 'im w'at he mean by hangin' roun' his 'oman. De man didn' 'spon' ter suit Dan, en one word led ter anudder,
Till by dis cunjuh man's son pull out a knife and started to stick it in Dan. But befo' he could get it drawed good, Dan haul off and hit him in the head so hard dat he never got up. Dan 'lowed he'd come to atter a while en go 'long 'bout his business, so he went off en lef' him layin' there on the groun'. De nex' mawnin' de man was foun' dead. Dey was a great 'miration made 'bout it, but Dan didn' say nuffin, en none er de other niggers hadn' seen de fight, so dey wa'n't no way ter tell who done de killin'. En bein' ez it was a free nigger, en dey wa'n't no w'ite folks spesh'ly int'rested, dey wa'n't nuffin done 'bout it, en de cunjuh man come en tuk his son en kyar'd 'im away en buried 'im. Now Dan hadn't meant ter kill dis nigger, en w'iles he knowed de man hadn't got no mo' d'n he deserved, Dan commenced ter worry mo' er less. Fer he knowed dis man's daddy would wuk his roots en prob'ly fin' out who'd kilt his son, en make all de trouble fer 'im he could. En Dan kep' on studyin' 'bout dis till he got so he didn' hardly das ter eat er drink fer fear dis cunjuh man had poison de vittles er de water. Fin'lly he 'lowed he'd go ter see Aun Peggy, de new cunjuh woman w'at had moved down by de Wilmington Road, en ax her fer ter do sump'n ter protect 'im fum dis cunjuh man. So he tuk a peck er 'taters en went down ter her cabin one night. Aun Peggy heared his tale, en den says she, 'Dat cunjuh man is mo' d'n twice ez ole ez I is, en he kin make monst'us powerful goopher. W'at you needs is a life cha'm, en I'll make you one termorrer. It's de only thing w'at'll do you any good. You leave me a couple er hairs from yo' head, en fetch me a pig termorrer night fer de roas', en w'en you come, I'll have de cha'm all ready fer you.' So Dan went down to Aun Peggy de nex' night, wid a young shote, en Aun Peggy gun 'im de cha'm. She had tuk de hairs Dan had lef wid her in a piece er red flannin, en some roots en yerbs, en had put 'em in a little bag made out er coon skin. 'You take dis cha'm,' says she, 'en put it in a bottle er a tin box, en bury it deep under de root er a live oak tree, en ez long ez it stays dere safe en soun', dey ain' no poison kin poison you, dey ain' no rattlesnake kin bite you, dey ain' no scorpion kin sting you. Dis yer cunjuh man mought do one thing er nudder ter you, but he can't kill you. So you neenter be at all skeered, but go 'long 'bout yo' business en don't bother yo' min'.' So Dan went down by de river, en way up on de bank he buried de cha'm deep under de root of a live oak tree, en covered it up en stomped de dirt down en scattered leaves over de spot, en den went home wid his min' easy. Sho' 'nuff, dis yer cunjuh man wuked his roots, des ez Dan had 'spected he would, en soon l'arned who kilt his son. En co'se he made up his min' fer ter git even wid Dan, so he sont a rattlesnake fer ter sting 'im, but de rattlesnake say de nigger's heels was so hard he couldn't git his sting in. Den he sent his jaybird fer ter put poison in Dan's vittles, but de poison didn' wuk. Den de cunjuh man 'lowed he'd double Dan all up wid de rheumatiz, so he couldn't git his han' ter his mouf ter eat, en would hafter starve ter death. But Dan went ter Aun Peggy, en she gun 'im a ointment ter cure de rheumatiz. Den de cunjuh man 'lowed he'd burn Dan up wid a fever, but Aun Peggy tol' 'im how ter make some yerb tea fer dat. Nuffin dis man tried would kill Dan, so fin'lly de cunjuh man 'lowed Dan mus' hab a life cha'm. Now dis yer jaybird de cunjuh man had was a monst'us smart critter. Fac', de niggers 'lowed he was de ole debbil hisse'f, des settin' roun' waitin' ter kyar dis ole man away w'en he retched de een' er his rope. De cunjuh man sont dis jaybird fer ter watch Dan en fin' out whar he kep' his cha'm. De jaybird hung roun' Dan fer a week er so, en one day he see Dan go down by de ribber en look at a live oak tree, en den de jaybird went back ter his marster en tol' 'im he 'spec' de nigger kep' his life cha'm under dat tree. De cunjuh man laughed en laughed, en he put on his bigges' pot en fill it wid his strongest roots, en boil it, till bimeby de win' blowed en blowed till it blowed down de live oak tree. Den he stirred some mo' roots in de pot, en it rained en rained till de water run down de river bank en wash Dan's life cha'm inter de river, en de bottle went bobbin' down de current des ez unconsarned ez ef it wa'n't takin' po' Dan's chances all 'long wid it. En den de cunjuh man laugh some mo', en 'lowed ter hisse'f dat he was gwine ter fix Dan now, sho' 'nuff. He wa'n't gwine kill 'im des yet, fer he could do sump'n ter 'im w'at would hurt wusser'n killin'. So dis cunjuh man 'mence' ter gwine up ter Dan's cabin eve'y night, en takin' Dan out in his sleep, en ridin' 'im roun' de roads en fields ober de rough groun'. In de mawnin' Dan would be ez tired ez ef he hadn' be'n ter sleep. Dis kinder thing kep' up fer a week er so, en Dan had des 'bout made up his min' fer ter go en see Aun' Peggy ag'in, w'en who should he come across, gwine 'long de road one day to'ds sundown, but dis yer cunjuh man. Dan felt kinder skeered at fus', but den he 'membered 'bout his life cha'm, w'ich he hadn' be'n ter see fer a week er so, en 'lowed wuz safe en soun' under de live oak tree. En so he helt up his head en walk' 'long des lack he didn' keer nuffin 'bout dis man no mo'n any yuther nigger. W'en he got close ter de cunjuh man, dis cunjuh man sezee, 'Howdy, Brer Dan, I hope you er well.' W'en Dan seed de cunjuh man wuz in a good humor, en didn' 'pear ter bear no malice, Dan 'lowed maybe de cunjuh man hadn' foun' out who killed his son, en so he 'termine' fer ter let on lack he didn' know nuffin, en so sezee, 'Howdy, Uncle Jube.' Dis ole cunjuh man's name wuz Jube. 'I's putty well, thank you. How is you feelin' dis mawnin?' 'I's feelin' ez well ez ole nigger could feel w'at had los' his only son en his main dependence in his ole age. But den my son wuz a bad boy,' sezee, 'en I couldn't 'spec' nuffin e'se. I tried ter l'arn 'im de error er his ways en make 'im go ter chu'ch en prayer meetin', but it wa'n't no use. I don' know who killt 'im, en I don' wanter know, fer I'd be mos' sho' ter fin' out dat my boy had sta'ted de fuss. Ef I'd had a son like you, Brer Dan, I'd 'a' be'n a proud nigger. Oh, yes, I would, sho's you bawn. But you ain' lookin' ez well ez you oughter, Brer Dan. Dey's sump'n de matter wid you, en w'at's mo', I 'spec' you don' know w'at it is.' Now dis yer kinder talk natchully th'owed Dan off'n his guard, en fus' thing he knowed he wuz talkin' ter dis ole cunjuh man des lack he wuz one er his bes' frien's. He tole 'im all 'bout not feelin' well in de mawnin', en ax' 'im ef he could tell w'at wuz de matter wid 'im. 'Yas,' sez de cunjuh man, 'dere's a witch be'n ridin' you right along. I kin see de marks er de bridle on yo' mouf. En I'll des bet yo' back is raw whar she be'n beatin' you.' 'Yas,' 'spon' Dan, 'so it is.' He hadn' noticed it befo', but now he felt des lack de hide had be'n tuk off'n 'im. 'En yo' thighs is des raw whar de spurs has be'n drivin' in you,' sez de cunjuh man. 'You can't see de raw spots, but you kin feel 'em.' 'Oh, yas,' 'lows Dan, 'dey does hurt powerful bad.' 'En w'at's mo',' sez de cunjuh man, comin' up close ter Dan en whusperin' in his year, 'I knows who it is be'n ridin' you.' 'Who is it?' ax' Dan. 'Tell me who it is.' 'It's a ole nigger 'oman down by Rockfish Crick. She had a pet rabbit, en you kotch 'im one day, en she's be'n squarin' up wid you eber sence. But you better stop her, er e'se she'll be rid ter death in a mont' er so.' 'No,' sez Dan, 'she can't kill me, sho.' 'I don' know how dat is,' said de cunjuh man, 'but she kin make yo' life mighty mis'able. Ef I wuz in yo' place, I'd stop her right off.' 'But how is I gwine ter stop her?' ax' Dan. 'I don' know nuffin 'bout stoppin' witches.' 'Look here, Dan,' sez de yuther, 'you is a good young man. I likes you monst'us well. Fac', I feels like some er dese days I mought buy you fum yo' marster, ef I could eber make money ernuff at my business dese hard times, en 'dopt you fer my son. I likes you so well dat I'm gwine ter help you git rid er dis yer witch fer good en all. Fer des ez long ez she libs, you is sho' ter have trouble en mo' trouble.' 'You is de bes' frien' I got, Uncle Jube,' sez Dan, 'en I'll 'member yo' kindness ter my dyin' day. Tell me how I kin git rid er dis yer ole witch w'at's be'n ridin' me so hard.' 'In de fus' place,' sez de cunjuh man, 'dis ole witch neber comes in her own shape, but eve'y night at 10 o'clock she turns herse'f inter a black cat, en runs down ter yo' cabin en bridles you, en mounts you, en dribes you out thoo de chimbly, and ride you over the roughest places she can find. All you got to do is to set for her in the bushes side your cabin and hit her in the head with a rock or a lighted knot when she goes past." "But," says Dan, "how can I see her in the dark? And s'posen I hits her and misses her, or s'posen I just wounds her and she gets away, what's she gwine to do to me den?" "I's done studied 'bout all dem things," says de cunjuh man, "en it 'pears ter me de bes' plan fer you ter foller is ter lemme turn you to some creetur w'at kin see in de dark, en w'at kin run des ez fas' ez a cat, en w'at kin bite, en bite fer ter kill. En den you won't hafter have no trouble atter de job is done. I doan know whether you like dat er not, but dat is de sho'es' way." "I don't keer," 'spon' Dan. "I'd des ez lief be anything fer a hour er so, ef I kin kill dat ole witch. You kin do des w'at you er min' ter." "All right, den," says de cunjuh man, "you come down ter my cabin at half pas' 9 o'clock ter night, en I'll fix you up." Now dis cunjuh man, w'en he had got th'oo talkin' wid Dan, kep' on down de road 'long de side er de plantation, 'tel he met Mahaly comin' home fum wuk des atter sundown. "How de do, ma'am?" says he. "Is yo' name Sister Mahaly, w'at b'longs ter Mars Dugal' McAdoo?" "Yes," 'spon' Mahaly, "dat's my name, en I b'longs ter Mars Dugal'." "Well," says he, "yo' husban' Dan wuz down by my cabin dis ebenin', en he got bit by a spider er sump'n, en his foot is swole up so he can't walk, en he ax me fer ter fin' you en fetch you down dere ter he'p 'im home. Co'se Mahaly wanter see w'at had happen' ter Dan, en so she sta'ted down de road wid de cunjuh man. Ez soon ez he got her inter his cabin, he shet de do' en sprinkle some goopher mixtry on her, en tu'nt her ter a black cat. Den he tuk en put her in a barrel, en put a bo'd on de barrel, en a rock on de bo'd, en lef her dere 'tel he got good en ready fer ter use her. 'Long 'bout half pas' 9 o'clock, Dan come down ter de cunjuh man's cabin. It was a warm night, en de do' was stannin' open. De cunjuh man 'vised Dan ter come in en pass de time er day wid 'im. Ez soon ez Dan commenced talkin', he heared a cat meowin' en scratchin' en gwine on at a turrible rate. "What's all dat fuss about?" ax' Dan. "Oh, dat ain' nuffin but my ole gray tomcat," says de cunjuh man. "I has ter shut 'im up sometimes fer ter keep 'im in nights, en co'se he don't lack it. Now," 'lows de cunjuh man, "lemme tell you des w'at you is got ter do. W'en you ketches dis witch, you mus' take her right by de throat en bite her right th'oo de neck. Be sho' yo' teef goes th'oo at de fus' bite, en den you won't never be bothered no mo' by dat witch. En w'en you git done, come back here en I'll turn you to yo'self ag'in, so you kin go home en git yo' night's res'." Den de cunjuh man gun Dan somethin' nice en sweet ter drink out'n a new gourd, en in 'bout a minute Dan foun' hisse'f tu'nt to a gray wolf, en soon ez he felt all four his new feet on de groun', he sta'ted off fas' ez he could fer his own cabin, so he could be sho' en be dere time enough ter catch de witch en put a een' ter her carryin's on. Ez soon ez Dan wuz gone good, de cunjuh man tuk de rock off'n de bo'd en de bo'd off'n de barrel, en out lep Mahaly en sta'ted fer ter go home, des like a cat er a 'oman er anybody else would w'at wuz in trouble, en it wa'n't many minutes befo' she wuz gone up de path ter her own do'. Meanwhiles, w'en Dan had retch de cabin, he had hid hisse'f in a bunch er jimson weeds in de yard. He hadn't waited long befo' he seed a black cat run up de path to'ds de do'. Des ez soon ez she got close ter him, he leapt out en ketch her by de throat, en got a grip on her des like de cunjuh man had tole him ter do, en lo en behold, no sooner had de blood commenced ter flow dan de black cat tu'nt back ter Mahaly, en Dan seed dat he had kilt his own wife. En w'iles her breff wuz gone she call out, 'Oh, Dan! Oh, my husban'! Come en he'p me! Come en save me fum dis wolf w'at's killin' me!' W'en po' Dan sta'ted tu'rds her, ez any man nat'ally would, it des made her holler wuss en wuss, fer she didn' know dis yer wolf wuz her Dan. En Dan des had ter hide in de weeds en grit his teef en hol hisse'f in 'tel she passed out in her misery calling for Dan to the last, and wondering why he didn't come and help her. And Dan 'lowed to hisself he'd ruther 'd been kilt a dozen times than to done what he had to Mahaly. Dan was mighty nigh 'stracted, but when Mahaly was dead and he got his mind straightened out a little, it didn't take him mo' d'n a minute er so fer to see th'ough all de cunjuh man's lies, and how de cunjuh man had fooled him and made him kill Mahaly fer to git even wid him fer killin' of his son. He kep' gettin' madder en madder, en Mahaly hadn't much mo' d'n drawed her las' breff befo' he started back ter de cunjuh man's cabin hard ez he could run. W'en he got dere, de do' was standin' open, a lighted knot was flickin' on de hearth, and de ole cunjuh man was settin' dere noddin' in de corner. Dan leapt in de do' en jump' fer dis man's throat, en got de same grip on him w'at de cunjuh man had tole him 'bout half hour befo'. It was hard work dis time, fer de ole man's neck was monst'us tough en stringy, but Dan hilt on long enough ter be sho' his job was done right. En eben den he didn't hold on long enough, fer w'en he turnt de cunjuh man loose en he fell ober on de flo', de cunjuh man rolt his eyes at Dan, en sezee, 'I's eben wid you, Brer Dan, en you er eben wid me. You kilt my son, en I kilt yo' woman, en ez I don't want no mo' d'n w'at's fair 'bout dis thing, ef you'll retch up wid yo' paw en take down dat gourd hangin' on dat peg ober de chimbley, en take a sip er dat mixtry, it'll turn you back to a nigger ag'in, en I kin die mo' satisfied 'n ef I lef you like you is.' Dan nebber 'lowed fer a minute dat a man would lie wid his las' breff, en co'se he seed de sense er gittin' turnt back befo' de cunjuh man died, so he clumb on a chair en retch fer de gourd en tuk a sip er de mixtry. En ez soon ez he done dat, de cunjuh man laugh his las' laugh, en gasped out wid his las' gaps. 'Uh-huh, I reckon I's square wid you now fer killin' me too, fer dat goopher on you is done fix en sot now fer good, en all de cunjuh in de worl' won't nebber take it off. Wolf you is en wolf you stays, all de res' er yo' bawn days.' Co'se Brer Dan couldn't do nuffin. He knowed it wa'n't no use, but he clummed up on de chimbley en got down de gourds en bottles en other cunjuh fixin's, en tried 'em all on hisse'f, but dey didn't do no good. Den he run down ter ole Aun' Peggy, but she didn't know de wolf language, en couldn't 'a' took off dis other goopher nohow, even ef she'd 'a' understood w'at Dan was sayin'. So po' Dan was 'bleeged ter be a wolf all de rest er his bawn days. Dey foun' Mahaly down by her own cabin nex' mawnin', en eve'ybody made a great 'miration 'bout how she'd be'n kilt. De niggers 'lowed a wolf had bit her. De w'ite folks say no, dey ain' be'n no wolves roun' dere fer 10 years er mo', en dey didn't know w'at ter make out'n it. En w'en dey couldn't fin' Dan nowhere, dey 'lowed he'd quarreled wid Mahaly en kilt her, en run away, en dey didn't know w'at ter make er dat, fer Dan en Mahaly was de mos' lovin' couple on de plantation. Dey put de dogs on Dan's scent, en track 'im down ter ole Uncle Jube's cabin, en foun' de ole man dead, en dey didn't know w'at ter make er dat. En den Dan's scent gun out, en dey didn't know w'at ter make er dat. Mars Dugal' tuk on a heap 'bout losin' 2 er his bes' han's in one day, en ole missus 'lowed it was a jedgment on 'im fer sump'n he'd done. But dat fall de crops was monst'us big, so Mars Dugal' say de Lawd had tempered de win' ter de shone ram, en make up ter 'im fer w'at he had los'. Dey buried Mahaly down in dat piece er low groun' you er talkin' 'bout cl'arin' up. Ez fer po' Dan, he didn't have nowhere e'se ter go, so he des stayed roun' Mahaly's grave, w'en he wa'n't out in yonder woods gittin' sump'n ter eat. En sometimes w'en night would come, de niggers useter hear 'im howlin' en howlin' down dere, des fittin' ter break his heat. En den some mo' on 'em said dey seed Mahaly's ha'nt dere 'bun'ance er times, colloguin' wid dis gray wolf. En eben now, 50 years sence, long atter ole Dan is died en dried up in de woods, his ha'nt en Mahaly's hangs roun' dat piece er low groun', en eve'ybody w'at goes 'bout dere has some bad luck er nother, fer ha'nts don't lack ter be disturbed on dey own stompin' groun'." The air had darkened while the old man related this harrowing tale. The rising wind whistled around the eaves, slammed the loose window shutters,
and, still increasing, drove the rain in fiercer gusts into the piazza. As Julius finished his story, and we rose to seek shelter within doors, the blast caught the angle of some chimney or gable in the rear of the house, and bore to our ears a long wailing note, an epitome, as it were, of remorse and hopelessness. "Dat's jes' like po' ole Dan used to howl," observed Julius, as he reached for his umbrella. "En w'at I be'n tellin' you is de reason I don't lack ter see dat neck er woods cleared up. 'Cause it belongs ter you, en a man kin do ez he choose wid his own. But ef you gits rheumatiz, er fever en ague, er ef you're snake bit er poison wid some yerb er n'other, er ef a tree falls on you, er a haunt runs you en makes you git 'stracted in yo' min', like some folks I knows w'at went foolin' roun' dat piece er lan', you can't say I neber warned you, suh, en tol' you w'at you might look fer en be sho' ter fin'." When I cleared up the land in question, which was not until the following year, I recalled the story Julius had told us, and looked in vain for a sunken grave, or perhaps a few weather bleached bones of some denizen of the forest. I cannot say, of course, that some one had not been buried there, but if so, the hand of time had long since removed any evidence of the fact. If some lone wolf, the last of his pack, had once made his den there, his bones had long since crumbled into dust and gone to fertilize the rank vegetation that formed the undergrowth of this wild spot. I did find, however, a bee tree in the woods, with an ample cavity in its trunk, and an opening through which convenient access could be had to the stores of honey within. I have reason to believe that ever since I had bought the place, and for many years before, Julius had been getting honey from this tree. The gray wolf's haunt had doubtless proved useful in keeping off too inquisitive people, who might have interfered with his monopoly. End of The Gray Wolf's Haunt. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. Section 7 of The Conjure Woman. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by James K. White. Section 7 of The Conjure Woman by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT. Hotfoot Hannibal. I hate you and despise you. I wish never to see you or speak to you again. Very well, I will take care that henceforth you have no opportunity to do either. These words, the first in the passionately vibrant tones of my sister-in-law, and the latter in the deeper and more restrained accents of an angry man, startled me from my nap. I had been dozing in my hammock on the front piazza, behind the honeysuckle vine. I had been faintly aware of a buzz of conversation in the parlor, but had not at all awakened to its import until these sentences fell, or I might rather say were hurled upon my ear. I presume the young people had either not seen me lying there, the Venetian blinds opening from the parlor windows upon the piazza were partly closed on account of the heat, or else in their excitement they had forgotten my proximity. I felt somewhat concerned. The young man, I had remarked, was proud, firm, jealous of the point of honor, and, from my observation of him, quite likely to resent to the bitter end what he deemed a slight or an injustice. The girl, I knew, was quite as high-spirited as young Murchison. I feared she was not so just, and hoped she would prove more yielding. I knew that her affections were strong and enduring, but that her temperament was capricious and her sunniest moods easily overcast by some small cloud of jealousy or pique. I had never imagined, however, that she was capable of such intensity as was revealed by these few words of hers. As I say, I felt concerned. I had learned to like Malcolm Murchison, and had heartily consented to his marriage with my ward, for it was in that capacity that I had stood for a year or two to my wife's younger sister, Mabel. The match, thus rudely broken off, had promised to be another link binding me to the kindly Southern people among whom I had not long before taken up my residence. Young Murchison came out of the door, cleared the piazza in 2 strides without seeming aware of my presence, and went off down the lane at a furious pace. A few moments later Mabel began playing the piano loudly, with a touch that indicated anger and pride and independence, and a dash of exultation, as though she were really glad that she had driven away forever the young man whom the day before she had loved with all the ardor of a first passion. I hoped that time might heal the breach and bring the 2 young people together again. I told my wife what I had overheard. In return, she gave me Mabel's version of the affair. "I do not see how it can ever be settled," my wife said. "It is something more than a mere lovers' quarrel. It began, it is true, because she found fault with him for going to church with that hateful Branson girl. But before it ended there were things said that no woman of any spirit could stand. I am afraid it is all over between them." I was sorry to hear this. In spite of the very firm attitude taken by my wife and her sister, I still hoped that the quarrel would be made up within a day or 2. Nevertheless, when a week had passed with no word from young Murchison, and with no sign of relenting on Mabel's part, I began to think myself mistaken. One pleasant afternoon, about 10 days after the rupture, old Julius drove the rockaway up to the piazza, and my wife Mabel and I took our seats for a drive to a neighbor's vineyard, over on the Lumberton plank road. "Which way shall we go?" I asked, "the short road or the long one?" "I guess we had better take the short road," answered my wife. "We will get there sooner." "It's a mighty fine drive roun' by the big road, Miss Annie," observed Julius, "and it don't take much longer to get there." "No," said my wife, "I think we will go by the short road. There is a bay tree in blossom near the mineral spring, and I wish to get some of the flowers." "I 'spects you'd find some bay trees 'long de big road, ma'am," suggested Julius. "But I know about the flowers on the short road, and they are the ones I want." We drove down the lane to the highway, and soon struck into the short road leading past the mineral spring. Our route lay partly through a swamp, and on each side the dark, umbrageous foliage, unbroken by any clearing, lent to the road solemnity, and to the air a refreshing coolness. About half a mile from the house, and about half way to the mineral spring, we stopped at the tree of which my wife had spoken, and reaching up to the low-hanging boughs, I gathered a dozen of the fragrant white flowers. When I resumed my seat in the rockaway, Julius started the mare. She went on for a few rods, until we had reached the edge of a branch crossing the road, when she stopped short. "Why did you stop, Julius?" I asked. "I didn't, suh," he replied. "'Twas de mare stop. Git 'long dere, Lucy. What you mean by dis foolishness?" Julius jerked the reins and applied the whip lightly, but the mare did not stir. "Perhaps you had better get down and lead her," I suggested. "If you get her started, you can cross on the log and keep your feet dry." Julius alighted, took hold of the bridle, and vainly essayed to make the mare move. She planted her feet with even more evident obstinacy. "I don't know what to make of this," I said. "I have never known her to balk before. Have you, Julius?" "No, suh," replied the old man, "I neber has. It's a cu'ous thing to me, suh." "What's the best way to make her go?" "I 'spects, suh, dat ef I'd tu'n her roun', she'd go de udder way." "But we want her to go this way." "Well, suh, I 'low ef we jes' set here fer 5 minutes, she'll sta't up by herse'f." "All right," I rejoined. "It is cooler here than any place I have struck to day. We'll let her stand for a while, and see what she does." We had sat in silence for a few minutes, when Julius suddenly ejaculated,
Uh-huh. I knows why this mare don't go. It just flashed across my recommembrance." "Why is it, Julius?" I inquired. "'Cause she sees Chloe." "Where is Chloe?" I demanded. "Chloe done been dead these 40 years or mo'," the old man returned. "Her haunt is settin' over yonder on the other side of the branch, under that willow tree, dis blessed minute." "Why, Julius," said my wife, "do you see the haunt?" "No," he answered, shaking his head, "I don't see her, but the mare sees her." "How do you know?" I inquired. "Well, suh, dis yer is a gray hoss, and dis yer is a Friday, and a gray hoss can alluz see a haunt w'at walks on Friday." "Who is Chloe?" said Mabel. "And why does Chloe's haunt walk?" asked my wife. "It's all in the tale, ma'am," Julius replied, with a deep sigh. "It's all in the tale." "Tell us the tale," I said. "Perhaps by the time you get through, the haunt will go away and the mare will cross." I was willing to humor the old man's fancy. He had not told us a story for some time, and the dark and solemn swamp around us, the amber colored stream flowing silently and sluggishly at our feet, like the waters of Lethe, the heavy aromatic scent of the bays faintly suggestive of funeral wreaths, all made the place an ideal one for a ghost story. "Chloe," Julius began in a subdued tone, "used to belong to ole Mars Dugal' McAdoo, my ole marster. She was a lackly gal and a smart gal, and ole Miss tuk her up to de big house and l'arnt her to wait on de w'ite folks, till bimeby she come ter be Missus' own maid, and 'peared to 'low she run de house herse'f, to hear her talk about it. I was a young boy den, and used ter wuk 'bout de stables, so I knowed eve'ything dat wuz gwine on roun' de plantation. Well, one time Mars Dugal' wanted a house boy, and sont down to de quarters fer ter hab Jeff and Hannibal come up to de big house nex' mawnin'. Ole marster and ole miss looked de two boys ober, and 'scussed wid derselves fer a little w'ile, en den Mars Dugal' sezee, 'We lacks Hannibal de bes', en we gwine ter keep 'im. Hey, Hannibal, you'll wuk at de house fum now on, en ef you er a good nigger en min's yo' bizness, I'll give you Chloe fer a wife nex' spring. You other nigger, you, Jeff, you kin go back ter de quarters, we ain' gwine ter need you.' Now Chloe had be'n stannin' dere behin' ole Miss doin' all dis yer talk, en Chloe made up her min' fum de ve'y fus' minute she sot eyes on dem two dat she didn' like dat nigger Hannibal, en wa'n't never gwine ter keer fer 'im, en she wuz des ez sho' dat she liked Jeff, en wuz gwine ter set sto' by 'im, whether Mars Dugal' tuk 'im in de big house er no. En so, co'se, Chloe wuz monst'us sorry w'en ole Mars Dugal' tuk Hannibal en sont Jeff back. So she slipped roun' de house en waylaid Jeff on de way back ter de quarters, en tol' 'im not ter be downhearted, fer she wuz gwine ter see ef she couldn't fin' some way er 'nudder ter git rid er dat nigger Hannibal, en git Jeff up ter de house in his place. De new house boy cotch on monst'us fas', en it wa'n't no time hardly befo' Mars Dugal' en ole Miss bofe commenced ter 'low Hannibal wuz de bes' house boy dey eber had. He wuz peart en supple, quick ez lightnin', en sharp ez a razor. But Chloe didn' like his ways. He wuz so sho' he wuz gwine ter git her in de spring dat he didn' 'pear ter 'low he had ter do any co'tin', en w'en he'd run 'cross Chloe 'bout de house, he'd swell roun' her in a biggity way, en say, 'Come here en kiss me, honey, you gwine ter be mine in de spring. You don't 'pear ter be ez fon' er me ez you oughter be.' Chloe didn' keer nuffin fer Hannibal, en hadn't keered nuffin fer 'im, en she sot des ez much sto' by Jeff ez she did de day she fus' laid eyes on 'im. En de mo' familiar dis yer Hannibal got, de mo' Chloe let her min' run on Jeff, en one evenin' she went down ter de quarters en watch' till she got a chance fer ter talk wid 'im by herse'f. En she tole Jeff fer ter go down en see ole Aun' Peggy, de Conjure Woman down by de Wim'l'ton Road, en ax her ter give 'im somethin' ter help git Hannibal out'n de big house, so de w'ite folks 'u'd sen' fer Jeff ag'in. En bein' ez Jeff didn' have nuffin ter give Aun' Peggy, Chloe gun 'im a silver dollar en a silk handkerchief fer ter pay her wid, fer Aun' Peggy nebber lack ter wuk fer nobody fer nuffin. So Jeff slip off down to Aunt Peggy's one night and gunted a present he brung her, and told her all about him and Chloe and Hannibal, and asked her to help him out. Aunt Peggy told him she'd work her roots, and for him to come back the next night, and she'd tell him what she could do for him. So the next night Jeff went back, and Aunt Peggy gun him a baby doll with a body made out in a piece of cornstalk, and with splinters for arms and legs, and a head made out in elderberry pith, and 2 little red peppers for feet. This here baby doll, says she, is Hannibal. This here pith head is Hannibal's head, and these here pepper feet is Hannibal's feet. You take this and hide it under the house, on the sill under the door, where Hannibal have to walk over it every day. And as long as Hannibal comes anywhere near this baby doll, he'll be just like it is, light-headed and hot-footed. And if them 2 things don't get him into trouble mighty soon, then I'm no conjure woman. But when you get Hannibal back out in the house, and get all through with this baby doll, you must fetch it back to me, for it's monstrous powerful goofer, and is liable to make more trouble if you leave it laying around. Well, Jeff took the baby doll and slipped up to the big house and whistled to Chloe, and when she come out he told her what old Aunt Peggy had said, and Chloe showed him how to get under the house, and when he had put the conjure doll on the sill, he went along back to the quarters and just waited. Next day, sure enough, the goofer commenced to work. Hannibal started in the house soon in the morning with an armful of wood to make a fire, and he hadn't more than got across the door sill before his feet begun to burn, so that he dropped the armful of wood on the floor and woke old Miss up an hour sooner than usual. And, 'course, old Miss didn't like that and spoke sharp about it. When dinner time come, and Hannibal was helping to cook care of the dinner from the kitchen into the big house, and was getting close to the door where he had to go in, his feet started to burn, and his head began to swim, and he let the big dish of chicken and dumplings fall right down in the dirt, in the middle of the yard, and the white folks had to make their dinner that day off'n cold ham and sweet taters. The next morning he overslept himself, and got into more trouble. After breakfast, Mars Dugal sent him over to Mars Marrabo Utley's for to borrow a monkey wrench. He ought to been back in half an hour, but he come poking home 'bout dinner time with a screwdriver instead of a monkey wrench. Mars Dugal sent another nigger back with the screwdriver, and Hannibal didn't get no dinner. Along in the afternoon, old Miss sought Hannibal to weedin' the flowers in the front garden, and Hannibal dug up all the bulbs old Miss had sent away for, and paid a lot of money for, and took 'em down to the hog pen by the barnyard and fed 'em to the hogs. When old Miss come out in the cool of the evening and seed what Hannibal had done, she was most crazy, and she wrote a note and sent Hannibal down to the overseer with it. But what Hannibal got from the overseer didn't 'pear to do no good. Every now and then his feet 'd commence to torment him, and his mind 'd get all mixed up, and his conduct keep getting worser and worser, till finally the white folks couldn't stand it no longer, and Mars Dugal took Hannibal back down to the quarters. "Mrs. Smith," says Mars Dugal to the overseer, "dis here nigger is done got so triflin' here lately dat we can't keep him in the house no more, and I's fotch him to you to be straightened up. You's had 'casion to deal wid him once, so he knows what to expect. You jes' take him in hand and lemme know how he turns out, and when the hands come in from the field dis evenin', you can send dat yeller nigger Jeff up to the house. I'll try him and see if he's any better than Hannibal." So Jeff went up to the big house and pleased Mars Dugal and ole Miss and the rest of the family so well that they all got to liking him fust rate, and they'd 'a' forgot all 'bout Hannibal if it hadn't been for the bad reports what come up from the quarters 'bout him for a month or so. Fac' is dat Chloe and Jeff was so interested in one another since Jeff been up to the house that they forgot all about taking the baby doll back to Aunt Peggy, and it kept working for a while and making Hannibal's feet burn more or less, till all the folks on the plantation got to calling him Hotfoot Hannibal. He kept getting more and more trifling, till he got the name of being the most no-countest nigger on the plantation, and Mars Dugal had to threaten to sell him in the spring, when by and by the goofer quit working, and Hannibal commenced to pick up some and make folks set a little more store by him. Now dis here Hannibal was a monstrous smart nigger, and when he got rid of them soft feet, his mind kept running on his other troubles. Here 3 or 4 weeks before, he'd had a easy job waiting on the white folks, living off in the fat of the land, and promised the finest gal on the plantation for a wife in the spring, and now here he was back in the cornfield with the overseer cussing and a raring if he didn't get a hard task done, with nothing but cornbread and bacon and molasses to eat, and all the field hands making remarks and poking fun at him 'cause he'd been sent back from the big house to the field. And the more Hannibal studied about it, the more madder he got, till he finally swore he was going to get even with Jeff and Chloe if it was the last act. So Hannibal slipped away from the quarters one Sunday and hid in the corn up close to the big house till he see Chloe going down the road. He waylaid her, and says he, "Howdy, Chloe." "I ain't got no time for the fool with field hands," says Chloe, tossing her head. "What you want with me, Hotfoot?" "I wants to know how you and Jeff is getting along." "I 'lows that's none of yo' business, nigger. I don't see what 'casion any common field hand has got to mix in wid de 'fairs of folks w'at lives in the big house. But if it'll do you any good to know, I might say that me and Jeff is getting along mighty well, and we gwine to get married in the spring. And you ain't gwine to be invited to the weddin', nuther." "No, no," says he, "I wouldn't 'spect to be invited to the weddin', a common low-down field hand like I is. But I's glad to hear you and Jeff is getting along so well. I didn't know but what he had commenced to be a little tired." "Tired of me? That's ridiculous," says Chloe. "Why, that nigger lusts me so, I b'lieve he'd go through fire and water for me. That nigger is just wrop up in me." "Uh-huh," says Hannibal. "Then I reckon there must be some other nigger what meets a woman down by the crick in the swamp every Sunday evening, to say nothing about 2 or 3 times a week." "Yes, it is another nigger, and you is a liar when you say it was Jeff." "Maybe I is a liar, and maybe I ain't got good eyes. But less'n I is a liar, and less'n I ain't got good eyes, Jeff is gwine to meet dat woman dis evenin', 'long 'bout 8 o'clock, right down dere by de crick in de swamp, 'bout halfway betwixt dis plantation and Mars Marrabo Utley's." Well, Chloe told Hannibal she didn't believe a word he said, and called him a low-down nigger who was trying to slander Jeff 'cause he was more lucky'n he was. But all the same, she couldn't keep her mind from running on what Hannibal had said. She 'membered she'd heard one of the niggers say there was a gal over at Mars Marrabo Utley's plantation where Jeff used to go with some before he got 'quainted with Chloe. Then she commenced to figure back, and sure enough there was 2 or 3 times in the last week when she'd been helping the ladies with their dressing and other fixings in the evening, and Jeff might 'a' gone down to the swamp without her knowing about it at all. And then she commenced to remember little things which she had took no notice of before, and what'd make it appear like Jeff had something on his mind. Chloe set a monstrous heap of store by Jeff, and would 'a' done most anything for him, so long as he stuck to her. But Chloe was a mighty jealous woman, and while she didn't believe what Hannibal said, she seed how it could 'a' been so, and she determined to find out for herself whether it was so or no. Now Chloe hadn't seen Jeff all day, for Mars Dugal had sent Jeff over to his daughter's house, young Miss Margaret's, what lived 'bout 4 miles from Mars Dugal's, and Jeff wasn't expected home till evening. But just after supper was over, and whiles the ladies was setting out on the piazza, Chloe slip off from the house and run down the road, dis yer same road we come. And when she got most to the crick, dis yer same crick right befo' us, she kinder kep' in the bushes at the side of the road, till finally she seed Jeff sitting on the bank on the other side of the crick, right under dat ole willow tree dropping over the water yonder. And every now and den he'd get up and look up the road towards Mars Marrabo's on the other side of the swamp. First, Chloe felt like she'd go right over the crick and give Jeff a piece of her mind. Then she 'lowed she better be sure before she done anything. So she helt herself in best she could, getting madder and madder every minute, till by and by she seed a woman comin' down the road on the other side from towards Mars Marrabo Utley's plantation. And when she seed Jeff jump up and run towards that woman and throw his arms round her neck, po' Chloe didn't stop to see no mo', but just turnt roun' and run up to the house, and rush up on the piazza, and up and told Mars Dugal and ole Miss all about the baby doll and all about Jeff getting a goopher from Aunt Peggy and about what the goopher had done to Hannibal. Mars Dugal was monstrous mad. He didn't let on at first like he believed Chloe, but when she took and showed him where to find the baby doll, Mars Dugal turned white as chalk. "What devil's work is this?" says he. "No wonder the po' nigger's feet itched. Somethin' got to be done to l'arnt dat ole witch to keep her hands off my niggers. And as for dis yer Jeff, I'm gwine ter do jes what I promise, so de darkies on dis plantation'll know I means what I says." For Mars Dugal had warned de hands befo' 'bout foolin' wid conjuration. Fac', he had lost one or two niggers hisse'f fum dey bein' goophered, and he would 'a' had ole Aunt Peggy whipped long ago, only Aunt Peggy was a free woman, and he was feared she'd conjure 'em. And whiles Mars Dugal say he didn't believe in conjurin' and such, he 'peared to 'low it was best to be on the safe side, and let Aunt Peggy 'lone. So Mars Dugal done des ez he say. Ef ole Miss had pleed fer Jeff, he might 'a' kep' 'im, but ole Miss hadn't got over losin' them bulbs yit, and she neber said a word. Mars Dugal took Jeff to town nex' day and sole 'im to a speculator, who started down the river wid 'im nex' mornin' on a steamboat fer to take 'im to Alabama. Now, w'en Chloe tole ole Mars Dugal 'bout dis yer baby doll and dis udder goopher, she hadn't hardly 'lowed Mars Dugal would sell Jeff down Souf. Howsomeber, she was so mad wid Jeff dat she 'suaded herse'f she didn't care, and so she helt her head up and went roun' lookin' like she was rale glad about it. But one day she was walkin' down de road, when who should come 'long but dis yer Hannibal. When Hannibal seed her, he bust out laughin' fittin' fer to kill. "Ya, ya, ya, ho, 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 ha, ha, ha. Oh, hol' me, honey, hol' me, or I'll laugh myself to death. I ain' neber laugh so much sence I be'n bawn." "What you laughin' at, Hotfoot?" "Ya, ya, ya, what I laughin' at? Why, I's laughin' at myself, to be sho', laughin' to think what a fine 'oman I made." Chloe turnt pale, and her heart come up in her mouf. "What you mean, nigger?" says she, ketchin' holt er a bush by de road fer ter steady herse'f. "What you mean by de kinder 'oman you made?" "What do I mean? I means dat I got squared up wid you fer treatin' me de way you done, en I got eben wid dat yaller nigger Jeff fer cuttin' me out. Now I's gwine ter know w'at it is ter eat corn bread and molasses once mo', en work fum daylight ter dark, en ter hab a oberseer drivin' 'em fum one day's een' ter de udder. I means dat I sont word ter Jeff dat Sunday dat you was gwine ter be ober ter Mars Marrabo's visitin' dat evenin', en you want 'im ter meet you down by de crick on de way home en go de rest er de road wid you. En den I put on a frock en a sunbonnet, en fix myse'f up ter look like a 'oman, en w'en Jeff seed me comin', he run ter meet me, en you seed 'im, fer I'd be'n a watchin' in de bushes befo' en 'skivered you comin' down de road. En now I reckon you en Jeff bofe knows w'at it means ter mess wid a nigger like me." Po' Chloe hadn't heared mo' d'n half er de las' part er w'at Hannibal said, but she had heared 'nuff ter l'arnt dat dis nigger had fooled her and Jeff, en dat po' Jeff hadn't done nuffin, en dat fer lovin' her too much en goin' ter meet her, she had cause him ter be sole away, where she'd neber see him no mo'. De sun mought shine by day, de moon by night, de flowers mought bloom, en de mockin'birds mought sing, but po' Jeff was done los' ter her foreber en foreber. Hannibal hadn't mo' d'n finish' w'at he had ter say w'en Chloe's knees gun away under her, en she fell down in de road en lay dere half an hour er so befo' she come to. W'en she did, she crep' up ter de house des ez pale ez a ghost. En fer a mont' er so she crawl' roun' de house en 'peared ter be so po'ly dat Mars Dugal sont fer a doctor, en de doctor kep' on axin' her questions till he foun' she was des pinin' away fer Jeff. W'en he tole Mars Dugal laugh, en say he fix dat. She could hab de new house boy fer a husban'. But ole Miss say no, Chloe ain't dat kinder gal, en dat Mars Dugal should buy Jeff back. So Mars Dugal writ a letter ter dis yer speculator down to Wilmington, en tole ef he ain't sole dat nigger Souf w'at he bought fum him, he'd lack ter buy him back agin. Chloe commenced ter pick up a little w'en ole Miss tole her 'bout dis letter. Howsomeber, By Mars Dugal' got an answer from de speculator, who said he was monst'us sorry, but Jeff had fell overboard er jump off'n a steamboat on de way to Wim'l'ton, en got drown', en co'se he couldn't sell 'im back, much ez he'd like ter 'bleedge Mars Dugal'. Well, atter Chloe heared dis, she wa'n't much mo' use ter nobody. She purtended ter do her wuk, en ole Miss put up wid her, en had de doctor give her medicine, en let her go ter de circus en all sorts er things fer ter take her min' off'n her troubles, but dey didn' none of 'em do no good. Chloe got ter slippin' down here in de ebenin' des lack she 'uz comin' ter meet Jeff, en she set dere under dat willer tree on de udder side en wait fer 'im night atter night. Bimeby she got so bad de w'ite folks sont her ober ter young Miss Margaret's fer ter give her a change, but she runned away de fus' night, en w'en dey look' fer her de nex' mawnin', dey foun' her corpse layin' in de branch yonder, right 'cross fum whar we settin' now. Eber sence den," said Julius in conclusion, "Chloe's ha'nt comes eve'y ebenin' en sets down under dat willer tree en waits fer Jeff er else walks up en down de road yonder, lookin' en lookin', en waitin' fer her sweetheart w'at ain' neber eber come back ter her no mo'." There was silence when the old man had finished, and I am sure I saw a tear in my wife's eye, and more than one in Mabel's. "I think, Julius," said my wife, after a moment, "that you may turn the mare around and go by the long road." The old man obeyed with alacrity, and I noticed no reluctance on the mare's part. "You are not afraid of Chloe's haunt, are you?" I asked jocularly. My mood was not responded to, and neither of the ladies smiled. "Oh, no," said Annie, "but I've changed my mind. I prefer the other route." When we had reached the main road, and had proceeded along it for a short distance, we met a cart driven by a young negro, and on the cart were a trunk and a valise. We recognized the man as Malcolm Murchison's servant, and drew up a moment to speak to him. "Who's going away, Marshall?" I inquired. "Young Mistah Malcolm gwine away on de boat to New York dis ebenin', suh, en I'm takin' his things down to de wharf, suh." This was news to me, and I heard it with regret. My wife looked sorry, too, and I could see that Mabel was trying hard to hide her concern. "He's comin' 'long behin', suh, en I 'spec's she'll meet him up de road a piece. He's gwine ter walk down ez fur ez Mistah Jim Williams's, en take de buggy fum dere ter town. He 'spec's ter be gone a long time, suh, en say prob'ly he ain' never comin' back." The man drove on. There were few words exchanged in an undertone between my wife and Mabel, which I did not catch. Then Annie said, "Julius, you may stop the rockaway a moment. There are some trumpet flowers by the road there that I want. Will you get them for me, John?" I sprang into the underbrush, and soon returned with a great bunch of scarlet blossoms. "Where is Mabel?" I asked, noting her absence. "She has walked on ahead. We shall overtake her in a few minutes." The carriage had gone only a short distance when my wife discovered that she had dropped her fan. "I had it where we were stopping. Julius, will you go back and get it for me?" Julius got down and went back for the fan. He was an unconscionably long time finding it. After we got started again, we had gone only a little way, when we saw Mabel and young Murchison coming toward us. They were walking arm in arm, and their faces were aglow with the light of love. I do not know whether or not Julius had a previous understanding with Malcolm Murchison, by which he was to drive us round by the long road that day, nor do I know exactly what motive influenced the old man's exertions in the matter. He was fond of Mabel, but I was old enough and knew Julius well enough to be skeptical of his motives. It is certain that a most excellent understanding existed between him and Murchison after the reconciliation, and that when the young people set up housekeeping over at the old Murchison place, Julius had an opportunity to enter their service. For some reason or other, however, he preferred to remain with us. The mare, I might add, was never known to balk again. End of Hotfoot Hannibal. Recording by James K. White, Chula Vista. End of The Conjure Woman, by Charles Waddell CHESNUTT.